A policeman arrested a young guy for stealing in the supermarket, but when he searched his pockets, he found a note. What it said left him completely stunned. Hello, viewer. Thanks for joining us. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. The streets of Riverbend felt familiar under the soft grey light of early morning. Sergeant Mike Thompson walked his usual route through Main Street, the slight chill of the fall air brushing against his weathered face. Every step echoed his 40 years of service in the police department, a tenure etched with quiet pride and unspoken disappointments. At 60, he found himself at the cusp of a significant change, a retirement he had long awaited and dreaded in equal measure. Riverbend, nestled between sprawling hills and the rushing river that gave the town its name, carried an air of sleepy charm. The brick facades of its downtown stores, the neatly trimmed hedges in front of aging homes, and the familiar faces nodding greetings, all spoke of a community untouched by the fast-paced chaos of the world beyond. Yet beneath its surface lay struggles, unemployment creeping like ivy, families falling apart in silence, and young souls like Thomas Langley slipping through widening cracks. Mike paused near the diner, his usual coffee stop, and exchanged a nod with Betty, who had worked there as long as he could remember. He carried his morning brew to the park bench where he often sat, surveying the life of a town he had sworn to protect. A boy on a skateboard zipped past, chased by laughter from a group of kids playing tag. Mike smiled faintly, but the sight tugged at an old ache. His son, James, had once skated on these same sidewalks before the distance, both physical and emotional, had taken hold. James lived 3 states away now, managing his busy career with the same efficiency that left little time for his father. Their calls were brief, polite exchanges about health and weather, devoid of the connection Mike craved but no longer expected. James had his life, and Mike, a widower for 10 years, had the silence of his own. His modest home, a place of empty echoes since Mary's passing, stood like a reflection of his soul. Pictures of a younger James and Mary adorned the mantel, their smiles a stark contrast to the hollow quiet that now defined the place. He filled the void with his routines, but they felt fragile, poised to unravel as the badge he had carried for decades prepared to leave his chest. The police station buzzed with its usual rhythm when Mike arrived, the clatter of keyboards and the murmur of voices underscored by the occasional crackle of the dispatch radio. His desk was immaculate, his paperwork always in order, yet his colleagues joked that they couldn't wait to fill the space he'd leave behind with their own organized chaos. Mike chuckled with them, but felt the weight of every word. Did they see him as just another fixture of the station, soon to be boxed and forgotten? For all his dedication, Mike carried a quiet dissatisfaction. He had played by the rules, enforcing them with integrity, but he questioned if he had truly made a difference. Riverbend's crime rate was low, but its struggles were deeper: unemployment, addiction, families slipping apart. He had watched kids like Thomas grow up in this town, bright eyes dimming as life offered them little hope. Was he just a cog in a machine that patched the cracks without fixing the foundation? A call came through the radio, interrupting his thoughts. A shoplifting incident at Miller's Market. Routine. His partner, Dave, offered to take it, but Mike shook his head. It would give him something to do, and perhaps a chance to feel useful one last time. The market, with its aisles of neatly stacked goods, seemed almost too bright as he entered. The store manager, a wiry man with an ever-present frown, stood near the checkout, gesturing toward a young man in a hooded sweatshirt seated on the bench by the entrance. The boy's head hung low, his hands clasped tightly, the hood casting a shadow over his face. "Caught him trying to walk out with a loaf of bread and some canned goods," the manager said, shaking his head. "Didn't even run, just stood there when I stopped him." Mike studied the boy, something in his posture striking a chord. He introduced himself, his voice calm but firm, and asked the boy to stand. Slowly, the hood lifted, revealing a pale face streaked with dirt, eyes hollow but devoid of defiance. This was no hardened criminal. This was a kid with the weight of the world on his shoulders. "What's your name?" Mike asked gently. "Thomas," came the reply, barely a whisper. Mike's gaze fell to the small pile of groceries on the counter. Bread, canned soup, a carton of milk, basic sustenance. He glanced back at Thomas, whose trembling hands and downcast eyes spoke louder than any words. For reasons he couldn't yet articulate, this encounter felt different, as though the universe had nudged him toward it. "Let's take a walk," Mike said, gesturing toward the door. Thomas hesitated but complied. His head hung low as they stepped into the crisp air. The weight of the moment settled on Mike, a gnawing feeling that this was not just another shoplifting case. As they walked, the town seemed to fade, leaving only the sound of their steps and the unspoken tension between them. Mike felt a shift deep within him, as though he stood on the edge of a decision that could alter the course of his life in ways he couldn't yet fathom. The chill lingered in the air as Mike and Thomas walked toward the patrol car parked outside Miller's Market. Mike opened the passenger door and gestured for Thomas to get in. The young man hesitated, his lanky frame stiff with tension, but the quiet authority in Mike's expression left no room for debate. Without a word, Thomas slid into the seat, folding his hands tightly in his lap, as though bracing himself for whatever came next. Mike settled into the driver's seat and started the engine. The hum of the heater filled the silence, punctuated by the occasional crackle of the radio. He glanced at Thomas, whose eyes were fixed on the dashboard, his face pale and taut. Mike felt the weight of the boy's unease, like a presence in the small space. "Thomas, right?" Mike began, keeping his tone even. The boy nodded, his movements barely perceptible. "You want to tell me what happened back there?" Thomas shook his head, his lips pressed into a thin line. His refusal wasn't defiant, it was laden with shame, a barrier that Mike recognized from years of dealing with people cornered by circumstances beyond their control. He decided not to press, at least not yet. Instead, he shifted his approach. "That loaf of bread," Mike said, his voice softer, "doesn't look like you were planning a feast." Thomas flinched slightly, his fingers tightening around each other. "It wasn't for me," he muttered, the words spilling out so quietly that Mike almost missed them. Mike's curiosity sharpened. He turned the car toward the station but kept his foot light on the accelerator, allowing time for the conversation to unfold naturally. He had learned over the years that pushing too hard often closed doors that needed to remain open. "For someone else, then?" Mike prompted gently. He glanced sideways, catching the flicker of uncertainty in Thomas's expression. "My family," Thomas admitted after a long pause, his voice strained. "They needed it." The honesty in the boy's tone tugged at something deep within Mike. He thought of the years after his father's death, when his mother had scraped by, working 2 jobs to put food on the table. He remembered the embarrassment of second-hand clothes and the nights he had gone to bed hungry, his mother's weary face etched in his memory. The echo of those memories tightened his chest. "Why not just ask for help?" Mike asked, careful to keep judgment out of his voice. Thomas's head snapped up, his eyes flashing with a mixture of anger and despair. "From who?" he snapped, then immediately lowered his gaze, shame flooding his face. "Sorry, there's no one." "Nobody cares." Mike let the words settle, aware of their raw truth. He had seen it often, people falling through the cracks, their struggles invisible to those who could afford not to see. Riverbend might have been picturesque on the surface, but it was no stranger to poverty's quiet grip. The station came into view, its familiar brick facade, both a comfort and a reminder of the rigid system he had upheld for decades. Mike parked the car but didn't get out. Instead, he turned to Thomas, who sat hunched in his seat, his shoulders drooping under an invisible weight. "Listen, Thomas," Mike said, his voice firm but not unkind. "I've been doing this job a long time, and I know when someone's hiding something. If there's more to this, now's the time to speak up." Thomas hesitated, his lips parting as though he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. After a moment, he reached into the pocket of his hoodie and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. He held it out without meeting Mike's eyes. Mike unfolded the paper carefully, smoothing out the wrinkles. The handwriting was shaky but legible, a list of basic groceries and medications followed by a desperate scrawl. "Please forgive me. I had no choice." The note hit Mike like a blow to the chest, its simplicity speaking volumes about the desperation behind it. "Who wrote this?" Mike asked quietly, though he suspected the answer. Thomas swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "I did," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "For my grandma. She's sick, and we don't have anything." Mike leaned back in his seat, the paper still in his hand. He thought of the sterile policies and procedures that dictated his job, the rules he had followed without question for decades. But sitting beside him was a 19-year-old kid who had reached his breaking point, a kid who had stolen not out of greed, but out of necessity. "Where do you live, Thomas?" Mike asked, his tone softer now. Thomas glanced at him warily. "A few blocks from here, with my grandma and my brothers." "Why?" "Because," Mike said, folding the note and tucking it into his jacket pocket, "if I'm going to understand what's really going on, I need to see it for myself." The boy's eyes widened, panic flaring briefly before resignation settled over his features. He nodded, and Mike started the car again, turning toward the address Thomas provided. As they drove, a heavy silence filled the space between them. For the first time in years, Mike felt the ground shift beneath his feet, as though he were teetering on the edge of a decision he couldn't yet define. When they arrived, the sight of the small, run-down house with its peeling paint and sagging porch spoke volumes. Mike's chest tightened as he parked the car and stepped out, taking in the overgrown yard and the tattered curtains in the windows. The weight of what he was about to uncover settled heavily on his shoulders, but he knew he couldn't turn away. Not this time. Mike hesitated on the porch, his hand hovering just above the weathered wood of the door. From inside, faint voices and the clatter of something metallic broke the silence. He could feel Thomas watching him from the bottom step, the boy's posture a mix of defiance and dread. The house itself seemed to exhale exhaustion, from the sagging roofline to the peeling white paint that told stories of years gone by without care. When Mike finally knocked, the sound echoed louder than he expected. It wasn't long before the door creaked open, revealing a young boy with unkempt hair and wide, startled eyes. He couldn't have been more than 10, his small frame half hidden behind the door. "Who's there?" the boy called out, his voice carrying both innocence and the weariness of growing up too fast. "It's okay, Andy," Thomas said, stepping closer. "He's just here to help." Andy's gaze darted from Thomas to Mike, skepticism evident on his young face. Slowly, the boy stepped aside, letting them in. The house smelled faintly of damp wood and old linens, mingled with the metallic tang of overworked heating. The living room was cramped but tidy, as though someone had made an effort to maintain dignity amidst the chaos. A battered couch sat near a coffee table stacked with magazines, a few toys scattered around. Mike's attention was drawn to the far corner of the room, where an older woman sat in a recliner. She was frail, a thin frame wrapped in a faded quilt. Her face, pale and lined with deep wrinkles, bore the unmistakable marks of illness, sunken cheeks, dark circles under her eyes, and the slight tremor in her hands as she tried to adjust the blanket. "Grandma," Thomas said softly as he approached her, his tone shifting into something gentler. "This is Officer Thompson. He wanted to check in." The woman's eyes flickered open, her gaze heavy with exhaustion, but still sharp enough to size Mike up. "Checking in, huh?" she said, her voice rasping with each word. "We don't get many visitors these days." Mike approached cautiously, lowering himself to her eye level. "Mrs. Langley, I'm here because Thomas ran into some trouble earlier. I wanted to understand what's going on." Her brow furrowed, and her gaze shifted to Thomas, who stood awkwardly to the side, his hands shoved into his pockets. "Trouble?" she repeated, her voice tinged with worry. "It's okay, Grandma," Thomas said quickly. "It's nothing, just a misunderstanding." Mike raised a hand to stop the explanation. "Mrs. Langley," he said gently, "I found Thomas at the store. He took some things. Bread, soup, milk. He said it was for you and your family." The woman sighed, her frail body sinking deeper into the chair. "He shouldn't have done that," she murmured, her words barely audible. "I told him we'd manage." "Manage how?" Mike asked, his tone soft but firm. The question hung in the air, unanswered, as Thomas shifted uncomfortably. Andy had crept closer, standing near his grandmother with an expression that spoke of worry far too old for his years. A few moments later, another boy emerged from a doorway, no older than 6, his thumb lodged firmly in his mouth. He looked at Mike with wide, curious eyes before moving to sit on the floor beside his older brother. Mike took in the scene, his gaze sweeping over the small family, the weight of their struggle pressed against his chest. "How long has it been like this?" he asked, though he wasn't sure if he wanted to hear the answer. Eleanor Langley closed her eyes briefly, as though summoning strength. "Too long," she admitted finally. "After their parents. After the accident, I did what I could, but then my health went, and now we're just trying to hold on." Mike felt a lump form in his throat. He remembered the note Thomas had written, the desperation etched into every stroke of the pen. This wasn't just about stolen groceries. This was survival. "Why didn't you ask for help?" Mike asked, his voice quieter now. "From who?" Eleanor replied, her tone weary but pointed. "There's no one. And I'm not about to send those boys into foster care. They're all I have left." Her words hit Mike harder than he expected. He thought of his own family, the years he'd spent grieving Mary, the distance that had grown between him and James. For all his loneliness, he'd never faced this kind of struggle. He didn't know if he could. Thomas finally spoke, breaking the silence. "Look, Officer Thompson," he said, his voice steadier now, though still tinged with frustration. "I know what I did was wrong, okay? But I couldn't just sit around and watch us go hungry. I don't need a lecture, and I don't need a handout." Mike turned to face him, meeting the young man's fiery gaze. "And what if I told you there's more to this than just right and wrong?" he asked. "What if I said you don't have to do this alone?" Thomas looked away, his jaw tightening. "It doesn't matter," he muttered. "Nobody ever sticks around long enough to help." The bitterness in Thomas's words lingered in the room like a shadow, heavy and undeniable. Mike knew there was truth in them. He'd seen it before, time and again. And yet, something inside him stirred, a flicker of resolve that he hadn't felt in years. "Well," he said after a long pause, "maybe it's time that changes." Eleanor's eyes glistened briefly, but she quickly blinked away the emotion. Thomas didn't reply, but the look he gave Mike wasn't entirely dismissive. Andy tugged at his grandmother's quilt, leaning into her for comfort, while the youngest boy yawned and rested his head on his brother's shoulder. Mike stood, the tension in his body shifting as he took in the scene one last time. "I'll be back," he said firmly, addressing no one in particular. Then he turned to Thomas. "And next time, we're going to figure out a better way." "Agreed." Thomas hesitated before nodding, the faintest glimmer of trust beginning to flicker in his eyes. The ride back to the station was quiet, the kind of silence heavy with unspoken thoughts. Thomas sat rigidly in the passenger seat, his arms crossed over his chest, as if bracing himself for what might come next. Mike, behind the wheel, felt the weight of the moment pressing against him. The boy's story, his family's circumstances, and the fragile hope glimmering in Eleanor Langley's eyes refused to leave his mind. As they pulled into the station parking lot, Mike didn't kill the engine. He glanced at Thomas, whose gaze was fixed firmly on his lap, and made a decision he hadn't entirely thought through. Without a word, Mike shifted the car into reverse, turning out of the lot and heading back toward the heart of town. Thomas finally broke the silence. "What are you doing? Aren't you supposed to—" "Relax," Mike interrupted, his voice steady but firm. "We're not going inside, not yet." Thomas turned to face him, confusion etched on his face. "Why? Isn't this where you lock me up or whatever?" Mike kept his eyes on the road, his tone calm. "No one's locking anyone up today. I've got questions that need answers, and the station isn't the place for that." Thomas didn't respond, but the tension in his shoulders eased just slightly. The boy looked out the window, watching the streets of Riverbend pass by. Mike was taking them to the only place he could think of, a quiet spot where he could clear his head and try to piece together the tangled mess of emotions and facts that had taken root since this morning. When they arrived at the edge of the riverbank, the air was crisp and still, the late afternoon sun casting a golden glow over the water. Mike parked the car and stepped out, gesturing for Thomas to follow. The boy hesitated, but eventually climbed out, shoving his hands into his pockets as he trailed behind Mike toward a weathered wooden bench near the water's edge. "Sit," Mike said, gesturing to the bench. Thomas obeyed, his movements cautious, as though he wasn't sure what to expect. Mike leaned against a nearby tree, arms crossed, studying the boy. Thomas fidgeted, his gaze darting between the ground and the river. Mike decided to let the silence linger, knowing from experience that sometimes the best way to get someone to talk was to say nothing at all. Finally, Thomas broke. "Why are we here?" he asked, his voice a mix of frustration and wariness. Mike straightened, stepping closer. "Because I need to understand what's going on with you," he said simply. "And I don't think I'll get the truth if you're sitting in an interrogation room." Thomas scoffed. "What truth? You already saw it. We're broke. My grandma's sick. My brothers are kids. What else do you need to know?" "I need to know why you think it's all on you," Mike replied, his tone soft but insistent. "Why you feel like you're the only one who can hold it together." Thomas shook his head, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "Because I am. Who else is going to do it? Grandma can't even get out of her chair half the time. And Andy's just a kid. Joey doesn't even know what's going on. If I don't step up, nobody will." Mike nodded slowly, absorbing the boy's words. "And what about asking for help?" he pressed. "There are programs. People who don't care." Thomas cut him off, his voice rising. "You think I haven't tried? We've filled out forms, waited in lines, called numbers that never called back. You know what we got? Nothing. So yeah, I stopped asking." The rawness of Thomas's voice sliced through the late afternoon air, leaving an ache in Mike's chest. He had heard stories like this before, but they had always been at arm's length, abstract in their weight. This time, it felt personal, as if Thomas's desperation was a reflection of something Mike had overlooked for too long. "That's a lot for one person to carry," Mike said quietly after a pause. "Especially someone your age." Thomas laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "Age doesn't matter. Bills don't care if I'm 19. Joey still needs shoes. Andy still needs food. And Grandma—" His voice cracked, and he fell silent, staring hard at the ground. Mike took a step closer, his voice gentler now. "You're right. Life doesn't care about age. But it's not supposed to be like this, Thomas. You're not supposed to carry this weight alone. Thomas didn't reply, but Mike could see the tension in his shoulders begin to loosen, as though the boy was finally allowing himself to feel the exhaustion he had been burying for too long. "I saw your note," Mike said, pulling the crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. That wasn't the voice of someone stealing for fun. That was someone asking for help. Thomas's face reddened, his jaw tightening. "It doesn't matter," he mumbled. "Nothing changes." Mike crouched down, meeting the boy's gaze. "It does matter. You matter. And I can't promise to fix everything, but I can promise you're not invisible. Not to me." For the first time, Thomas looked at him directly, his eyes glistening with a mixture of defiance and vulnerability. Mike held his gaze, letting the moment stretch between them. Then, slowly, Thomas nodded, the faintest flicker of trust beginning to show. "Come on," Mike said, standing and nodding toward the car. "Let's figure this out together." As they walked back, the sound of the river accompanied them, steady and unyielding, like a quiet promise of resilience. Mike sat at his kitchen table that night, a mug of coffee untouched in front of him. The dim light from the overhead fixture cast long shadows across the small room, emphasizing its stillness. The events of the day replayed in his mind like a film on loop. Thomas's defiance, Eleanor's quiet dignity, the desperation etched into every corner of their lives. It all weighed on him, heavier than the badge he'd worn for 40 years. The walls of his home, adorned with photographs of a life long gone, seemed to close in. Mary's laugh echoed faintly in his memory, her voice urging him to do the right thing, even when it wasn't the easy thing. He sighed, running a hand over his face. The right thing wasn't clear anymore, not when rules and morality tangled in a web of uncertainty. The shrill ring of his phone broke the silence. Mike reached for it, his hand hesitating for a moment before answering. The caller ID read Dave, his longtime partner and friend. "Mike," Dave's familiar voice greeted him, laced with curiosity. "You're still up?" "Yeah," Mike replied, leaning back in his chair. "Couldn't sleep." "I heard about today," Dave said, his tone cautious. "The kid from Miller's. You brought him in." "Not exactly," Mike admitted. "I talked to him, took him home." There was a pause, the kind that carried judgment. "Home? You sure that's a good idea?" "You know the chief isn't going to like hearing about this." Mike's jaw tightened. "The chief doesn't know what I know." "And what's that?" "That the system's failed this kid. His family's hanging by a thread. If we throw him in a cell or slap him with charges, what good does that do?" Dave sighed on the other end of the line. "You've always been the straight shooter, Mike." "You sure you're ready to bend the rules for this?" "I'm not bending anything," Mike replied, though the words felt hollow. "I'm trying to make it right." "Just be careful," Dave said, his voice softening. "I know you want to help, but don't lose yourself in this. You've got your retirement coming up, your plans. Don't throw it all away for a kid you just met." Mike didn't respond immediately, the weight of Dave's words pressing against his already conflicted mind. "I'll see you tomorrow," he said finally, ending the call and letting the quiet of the house envelop him once more. The next morning, Mike found himself parked outside the Langley home. The sagging roof and peeling paint seemed even more weathered in the daylight, a stark reminder of the family's struggles. He took a deep breath before stepping out of the car, clutching a bag of groceries he'd picked up on his way. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Thomas answered the door, his expression guarded but not entirely closed off. "You're back," he said, more a statement than a question. Mike nodded, holding up the bag. "Thought you could use this." Thomas hesitated before stepping aside to let him in. Inside, the house felt even smaller with the light streaming through the thin curtains. Eleanor was in her recliner, her frail frame nearly swallowed by the quilt wrapped around her. Andy and Joey sat cross-legged on the floor, working on a puzzle spread across the coffee table. Eleanor's tired eyes lit up at the sight of Mike. "Officer Thompson," she greeted, her voice raspier than the day before. "You didn't have to come back." "I did," Mike said simply, setting the bag on the counter. "And it's just Mike." Thomas watched silently as Mike unpacked the groceries: bread, canned vegetables, milk, a box of cereal. "You didn't have to do this," he muttered, though his voice lacked its usual edge. "Maybe not," Mike replied, "but someone had to." Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her expression softening. "We appreciate it, Mike, really. But I hope you know we're not a charity case." Mike met her gaze, his tone gentle but firm. "I know that. This isn't charity. It's the least I can do." Thomas crossed his arms, his face a mixture of skepticism and gratitude. "Why are you doing this? You don't even know us." "I know enough," Mike replied, his voice steady. "I know you're in a tough spot, and I know what it's like to feel like the world's stacked against you. I've seen enough of this town to know it doesn't always take care of its own. So maybe it's time someone does." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Andy looked up from his puzzle, his small face filled with a cautious kind of hope. Joey leaned into his older brother, watching the exchange with wide eyes. Eleanor broke the silence. "You're a good man, Mike, but you have to be careful. People don't like it when someone breaks the mold." "I'm not worried about them," Mike said. "I'm worried about you." Thomas shifted uncomfortably, his gaze falling to the floor. "This doesn't change anything," he said quietly. "We still have bills. Grandma still needs medicine." "I know," Mike said, his voice softening, "and we'll figure it out, together." Thomas looked up, meeting Mike's gaze. For the first time, there was something more than suspicion in his eyes, something like trust. Mike stayed a while longer, helping Andy and Joey finish their puzzle while Eleanor rested. When he finally left, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. The weight of the law, of the rules he had lived by, felt lighter now, replaced by a sense of responsibility that was deeper, more personal. As he drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much larger than himself, and for the first time in a long time, he welcomed it. The church stood quietly at the edge of town, its white steeple reaching toward the pale winter sky. Mike parked his car in the gravel lot, the crunch of tires on stones breaking the morning stillness. The faint scent of cedar greeted him as he climbed the steps and pushed open the heavy wooden doors. Inside, the sanctuary was warm and hushed, the rows of polished pews glowing softly in the sunlight, streaming through stained glass windows. Reverend Henry Carter was exactly where Mike expected him to be, standing at the front of the room, a broom in hand, sweeping the floor with slow, deliberate strokes. He looked up as Mike approached, a smile spreading across his weathered face. "Mike Thompson," Henry greeted, leaning the broom against the altar. "What brings you here on a weekday? You've never been one for impromptu visits." Mike offered a faint smile, his hands stuffed in his jacket pockets. "I need to talk, Henry, and you're the only one I could think of." The Reverend gestured toward the front pew. "Sit," he said warmly. "I'll put on some coffee." Minutes later, they were seated side by side, steaming mugs in hand. Henry watched Mike carefully, his keen eyes taking in the tension in his friend's shoulders. "Something's on your mind," he said, breaking the silence. "What's going on?" Mike hesitated, his gaze fixed on the floor. "It's a kid," he began, his voice low. "Thomas Langley caught him shoplifting the other day." Henry leaned back, nodding slowly. "I know the family," he said. "Eleanor's been a member of this congregation for years, though she hasn't been able to come since her health got worse. Good people, but they've had a rough go of it." "Rough doesn't begin to cover it," Mike muttered, rubbing a hand over his face. He recounted the story: the theft, The note, the house barely holding together. As he spoke, the knot in his chest seemed to loosen, the weight of the past few days spilling out in his words. Henry listened without interrupting, his expression thoughtful. When Mike finally finished, the Reverend took a sip of his coffee, his silence stretching just long enough to make Mike uncomfortable. "So, what's the problem?" Henry asked finally, his tone gentle. Mike blinked, caught off guard. "The problem is, I don't know what to do. I've spent 40 years following the rules, doing things by the book. But this kid, this family, they're slipping through the cracks. If I follow protocol, Thomas gets a record. That could ruin his life. But if I don't..." He trailed off, shaking his head. "It feels like no matter what I do, someone loses." Henry nodded slowly, setting his mug on the pew beside him. "Let me tell you something, Mike. In my line of work, you see a lot of people at their lowest. You see the consequences of choices, the scars life leaves behind, and you learn pretty quickly that the law, the rules, they're not always the same as what's right." Mike looked up, his brow furrowed. "I can't just ignore the rules, Henry. They're there for a reason." "True," Henry agreed, "but sometimes the reason isn't enough. Sometimes you have to ask yourself, what's more important, following the rules or doing what you know in your heart is right?" The words hung in the air, sinking into Mike like stones. He thought of Thomas's quiet defiance, Eleanor's weary resolve, the boy's wide, hopeful eyes. He thought of his own son, James, the distance between them a chasm he'd never been able to bridge. What would James say if he knew his father had turned a blind eye to a family in need? Or worse, if he'd thrown the book at them without a second thought? "I don't even know where to start," Mike admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Henry smiled, a twinkle of mischief in his eyes. "That's the easy part. You've already started, Mike. You're here. You're thinking about it. You're asking questions. That's more than most people ever do." Mike let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "I don't know if it's enough." "It's a start," Henry said firmly. "And you don't have to do it alone." They sat in silence for a while, the sound of the broom Henry had abandoned earlier, the only noise in the sanctuary. Mike felt something shift inside him. Not a solution, not yet, but a glimmer of clarity. He wasn't sure where the road ahead would lead, but he knew he couldn't turn back. As he rose to leave, Henry clapped a hand on his shoulder. "One more thing, Mike," the Reverend said, his voice warm but serious. "Helping Thomas doesn't just mean fixing the immediate problem. It means giving him the tools to stand on his own. And that's not something you can do overnight." Mike nodded, the weight of Henry's words settling on him. "I'll keep that in mind." "Good," Henry said with a smile. "Now go, and remember, the world doesn't change unless we're willing to change with it." As Mike stepped out into the crisp morning air, he felt a faint sense of purpose stirring within him. The road ahead was uncertain, and the stakes were higher than he'd ever faced in his career, but for the first time in years, he felt something else too, a spark of hope, and that was enough. The sound of the clock ticking filled the quiet of Mike's office at the station. The pile of papers on his desk looked as untouched as it had that morning, his mind too preoccupied to focus on administrative duties. He stared at the badge lying flat in front of him, its once bright surface dulled by years of wear. It had been with him through every call, every late night, and every difficult decision. But now, as retirement loomed, it felt like both a comfort and a burden. Dave knocked lightly on the open door before stepping inside, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. "You've been staring at that thing all day," he said, nodding toward the badge. "Thinking of framing it or throwing it in the river?" Mike smirked, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Haven't decided yet." Dave pulled up a chair, his familiar presence grounding. "You know, You could have clocked out months ago. Nobody would have blamed you. Why are you still here?" Mike hesitated, the truth pressing against the edges of his thoughts. "Because I'm not done," he said finally, his voice steady but low. Dave raised an eyebrow, leaning back. "This about the Langley kid. It's about a lot of things," Mike admitted, "but yeah, he's part of it." Dave studied him for a moment, then set his coffee down. "You're not going to save the world in a couple of weeks, Mike. And you sure as hell can't fix 40 years' worth of regrets with one case." "I know that," Mike replied, his tone sharper than intended. He softened, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the desk. "But if I walk away now, without trying, I'll regret it for the rest of my life." Dave nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But just don't let this kid drag you down. You're a good cop, Mike. Always have been." Mike didn't answer. Instead, he picked up the badge, running his thumb over its edges. "I'll see you tomorrow," he said finally. A dismissal Dave understood without question. That evening, Mike found himself back at the Langley home. This time, he didn't bring groceries or advice, just himself. He knocked lightly on the door, and Andy was the one to answer, his face lighting up in recognition. "Hi, Officer Thompson," the boy greeted, stepping aside to let him in. "It's just Mike, remember," he said with a faint smile, ruffling Andy's hair as he stepped into the modest living room. Thomas was on the couch, flipping through a well-worn textbook. His posture was tense, as if he had been expecting bad news, but his expression softened when he saw Mike. "You're back," Thomas said, his tone cautious but not unwelcoming. "Wanted to talk?" Mike said, taking a seat in the worn armchair across from him. "And see how you're holding up." Thomas shrugged, glancing at the boys playing on the floor. "We're managing." Mike nodded, leaning forward. "I've been thinking about what you said. About how it feels like no one cares." Thomas raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. And I'm here to tell you that's not true," Mike said, his voice firm but kind. "I care. And there are other people who care too. You just haven't met them yet." Thomas scoffed, leaning back. "Yeah, sure." "I'm serious," Mike pressed. "I talked to someone today, Reverend Carter. He wants to help. There are programs we can look into, people who've been through what you're going through and made it out." Thomas's jaw tightened. The walls he'd built up clearly still intact. "Programs don't fix everything," he muttered. "They don't make Grandma better or keep the lights on." "You're right," Mike agreed, surprising him. "They don't fix everything, but they can help. And sometimes help is enough to get you through." For a moment, the only sound was the boys laughing as they built a tower out of toy blocks. Then Thomas sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "What's in it for you?" he asked finally, his voice laced with suspicion. Mike didn't hesitate. "Nothing. This isn't about me, Thomas. It's about you, your brothers, and your grandmother. It's about giving you a chance." Thomas studied him, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded, the smallest crack in his armor appearing. "Okay," he said quietly, "but I'm not promising anything." "That's good enough," Mike replied with a faint smile. "For now." Eleanor, who had been dozing in her recliner, stirred and opened her eyes. Her gaze softened when she saw Mike, and she offered a weak smile. "You've got a stubborn one on your hands, Officer Thompson." "Stubborn's not always a bad thing," Mike replied, glancing at Thomas. "Sometimes it's what keeps you going." Eleanor chuckled softly before her expression turned serious. "Thank you for coming back," she said, "for not giving up on us." Mike met her gaze, his voice steady. "I'm not going anywhere." When he left the house that evening, the stars were bright against the dark sky, the chill in the air biting at his skin. Mike walked slowly to his car, his thoughts a jumble of doubts and determination. Helping the Langley family wouldn't be easy. It might even cost him more than he was prepared to give, but as he sat behind the wheel, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, the quiet certainty that he was exactly where he was meant to be. He drove home with the faintest glimmer of hope lighting the way. This wasn't the end of the road, it was just the beginning. And for the first time in a long time, Mike was ready to see where it led. The Langley home was eerily quiet when Mike arrived the next morning. The stillness felt heavier than it had the night before, though the muffled sound of children's voices coming from the back room suggested life was stirring inside. He hesitated briefly before knocking, the weight of his task looming large. Today wasn't about observation, it was about action. Thomas opened the door, bleary-eyed and defensive as usual. "You're early," he muttered, stepping aside to let Mike in. Mike glanced at the living room, noting the faint smell of reheated coffee and the scattered remnants of a half-eaten breakfast on the table. Andy was leaning over a workbook, his pencil moving slowly as he copied out words. Joey was perched on the arm of the couch, watching his brother with a mix of curiosity and impatience. "I figured we'd get a head start," Mike said, his voice calm but deliberate. He set a small duffel bag on the table, the faint clink of its contents drawing Thomas's attention. "What's that?" Thomas asked, his tone guarded. "Supplies," Mike replied simply. "Food, first aid stuff, a few other things I thought you might need." Thomas's eyes narrowed. "We don't need charity." "It's not charity," Mike said firmly. "It's support. There's a difference." Eleanor's soft voice drifted from the corner, drawing both their attention. "Thomas," she said, her tone a mixture of exasperation and affection. "Let the man help. Stubbornness doesn't put food on the table." Thomas shot her a look, but it lacked any real heat. He crossed his arms, leaning against the wall as he watched Mike unpack. "So what's the plan?" he asked finally, his tone skeptical but curious. Mike placed a small stack of papers on the table. "First, we're going to take a look at what's available. There are programs Reverend Carter mentioned, ones that can help with food, utilities, and maybe even medical care for your grandmother." Thomas shook his head. "We've tried those before. They take forever, and half the time they don't do anything." "That's why I'm here," Mike replied, his voice steady. "We'll go through them together. If something doesn't work, we'll move on to the next thing." "But we're not giving up." Thomas let out a short laugh, though it lacked any real humor. "You make it sound so easy." "It's not," Mike admitted, "but it's better than doing nothing." Eleanor smiled faintly from her recliner, her hands folded over the quilt draped across her lap. "It's a start," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had lived through too many endings. Andy looked up from his workbook, his eyes bright with curiosity. "Does this mean we're going to get more food?" he asked, his voice innocent and hopeful. Mike crouched down so he was at the boy's level, his expression kind but serious. "That's the goal," he said, "but it's going to take some time, okay?" Andy nodded solemnly, his small face determined. Joey, sensing a shift in the room's energy, slid off the couch and stood beside his brother, clutching a toy car tightly in his hand. Thomas rubbed the back of his neck, his expression torn. "Fine," he said finally. "We'll try it your way. But if it doesn't work, then we'll figure something else out," Mike interrupted, his voice firm but not unkind. "One step at a time." The day passed in a blur of paperwork and phone calls, each step a small battle against a system that seemed designed to frustrate. Mike quickly realized the truth in Thomas's earlier words. Nothing about this process was easy. Automated menus, unhelpful operators, and endless lists of requirements made even the simplest task feel monumental. By mid-afternoon, Mike and Thomas sat side by side at the kitchen table, the once neat pile of papers now a scattered mess. Andy and Joey had retreated to the backyard, their laughter faint but comforting as they played in the brittle winter grass. Thomas slammed his pen down, frustration etched into every line of his face. "This is pointless," he snapped. "They're just going to tell us the same thing they always do. Wait." Mike didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "You're right," he said finally. "It's frustrating, it's slow, and it feels like no one cares. But that doesn't mean we stop." Thomas glared at him, though the fire in his eyes was more exhaustion than anger. "Why do you even care?" he asked, his voice raw. "You don't owe us anything." Mike met his gaze, his own eyes tired but resolute. "Because I've seen what happens when people give up. I've seen what happens when the system forgets about families like yours. And I don't want that to happen to you." Thomas's expression softened, though he quickly masked it with a shrug. "You've got a lot of faith in a broken system." "I've got faith in people," Mike countered. "And right now, I've got faith in you." Thomas looked away, his jaw tightening as he processed the words. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound, the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional giggle from the backyard. Finally, Eleanor broke the silence. "Thomas," she said gently, "he's trying to help. Let him." Thomas sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Fine," he muttered. "But if this doesn't work, don't say I didn't warn you." Mike allowed himself a small smile, the first real sign of progress glimmering in the boy's guarded expression. "Fair enough," he said. "Now, let's get back to it." As they dove back into the paperwork, the weight of the day felt a little lighter. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to keep going, enough to believe, just for a moment, that change was possible. And for Mike, that was more than enough to keep trying. The next day, the Langley home buzzed with a tentative energy, like the flickering of a light bulb, unsure whether to stay on or go out. Mike arrived just as Andy and Joey darted out the front door, bundled in mismatched coats and scarves, their laughter carrying in the cold morning air. "You're back again," Thomas greeted him at the door, his voice laced with his usual wariness. But there was something different in his posture, less guarded, more resigned to Mike's presence. "Didn't think you'd get rid of me that easily, did you?" Mike replied, stepping inside. The warmth of the house hit him, mingled with the faint scent of instant coffee and something frying on the stove. Eleanor looked up from her spot in the recliner, a faint smile crossing her pale face. "Mike," she said, her tone warm despite her obvious exhaustion. "I was wondering when we'd see you today." "Morning, Eleanor," Mike said with a nod, setting down the grocery bag he'd brought along. He turned to Thomas, who was still hovering near the doorway. "Got some updates from the calls we made yesterday?" Thomas crossed his arms, leaning against the wall. "Let me guess. More waiting." Mike shrugged, pulling a folder from his bag. "Some of it, yeah. But there's one program that looks promising. Help with utilities." "I've got the forms here." Thomas sighed but stepped forward, taking the folder from Mike. His fingers lingered on the edges of the papers, his expression unreadable. Eleanor's voice cut through the moment. "Thomas, sit down and let the man talk. You've been pacing like a caged animal all morning." Thomas rolled his eyes but complied, dropping into the chair across from Mike at the small kitchen table. Mike slid the papers closer to him, walking him through the details while Eleanor listened from her spot by the window. As they worked, the sound of children's laughter filtered in from outside. Every so often, Thomas's gaze drifted toward the window, his jaw tightening. Mike noticed but said nothing, letting the moment settle. Finally, Thomas broke the silence. "You ever feel like you're stuck? Like no matter what you do, nothing changes?" Mike looked up, surprised by the sudden vulnerability in the boy's voice. He set his pen down, leaning back in his chair. "More times than I can count," he admitted. "When my wife passed, it felt like the world had stopped, like I was just going through the motions." Thomas glanced at him, the hardness in his expression softening. "How'd you get out of it?" Mike hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "By realizing I didn't have to do it alone. It wasn't easy. I didn't want to ask for help, didn't think I needed it. But eventually, I figured out that leaning on the right people doesn't make you weak. It makes you human." Thomas looked away, his jaw tightening again. "I don't even know who the right people are anymore." "You'll figure it out," Mike said gently. "And when you do, don't be afraid to let them in." Thomas didn't respond, but the flicker of understanding in his eyes was enough for Mike to know the words had landed. They returned to the paperwork, the silence between them less strained than before. Later that afternoon, as Mike prepared to leave, he noticed Andy and Joey struggling with an old bicycle in the front yard. The chain had come loose, and the boys were huddled over it, their breath visible in the crisp air. "Need a hand?" Mike asked, approaching with his jacket zipped against the cold. Andy looked up, his face lighting up at the sight of Mike. "It's stuck," he said, gesturing to the chain. "We've been trying to fix it, but it won't work." Mike crouched down, inspecting the bike. The chain was rusted, the teeth of the gears worn down from years of use. "Looks like it's been through a lot," he said. "But I think we can fix it." Joey clapped his hands together, his excitement contagious. "Really?" "Really," Mike said with a smile. "But I'll need some help." The boys eagerly assisted, holding the bike steady while Mike worked. Thomas lingered on the porch, watching the scene with an expression that was equal parts curiosity and apprehension. Mike caught his eye briefly, but didn't push, focusing instead on the task at hand. After a few minutes of tinkering, the chain clicked back into place. Mike spun the pedals, testing the gears, and grinned when the bike moved smoothly. "There we go," he said, standing and brushing the dirt from his hands. "Good as new." Andy beamed, climbing onto the bike and pedaling in small circles around the yard. Joey chased after him, giggling as he tried to keep up. Their laughter echoed through the quiet neighborhood, a sound that felt like hope. Thomas stepped off the porch, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. "You didn't have to do that," he said, his tone quieter than usual. Mike shrugged. "Didn't hurt to help." Thomas studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Thanks," he said simply, the word carrying more weight than Mike expected. "Anytime," Mike replied. He clapped Thomas on the shoulder lightly before heading toward his car. "See you tomorrow." As Mike drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror, watching as Thomas joined his brothers in the yard. The sight of the three of them, laughing and playing in the cold, filled him with a quiet satisfaction. It wasn't much, a fixed bike, a small moment of joy, but it was a start, and for Mike, that was enough to keep going. The following day, Mike arrived at the Langley home to find Thomas outside, leaning against the rickety fence that bordered their yard. The late morning sun cut through the chill, casting long shadows over the patchy grass. Thomas's shoulders were hunched, his hands buried in his jacket pockets as he stared at the street, lost in thought. "You're early," Thomas said when he noticed Mike, though there was no edge in his tone this time. Mike smiled faintly. "So are you," Thomas shrugged. "Couldn't sleep." "Something on your mind?" Mike asked as he stepped closer. Thomas hesitated, then shook his head. "Nah, it's nothing." Mike didn't push, but he could sense the boy's restlessness. "Well, you'll have plenty to think about soon," he said, holding up a folder. "I've got a meeting lined up for us." Thomas frowned. "A meeting?" "With someone who can help," Mike explained. "Her name's Lucy. She's a neighbor of yours, actually. Works at the community center." Thomas's frown deepened. "Lucy Brown, the one with the noisy kid." Mike chuckled. That's the one. But she's also been helping families in situations like yours for years. She knows the ins and outs of the system better than anyone. Thomas crossed his arms, skepticism etched into every line of his face. Why would she want to help us? Because she's been where you are, Mike said simply. She's walked this road before and she came out the other side. Thomas didn't respond, but the doubt in his eyes gave way to something softer. Curiosity, maybe, or a faint glimmer of hope. The community center was a modest building tucked behind the main strip of Riverbend, its brick facade softened by a small garden out front. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and fresh paper, and the hum of activity filled the space. Lucy Brown was waiting for them in a small office at the back of the building. She was younger than Mike had expected, probably in her mid-30s, with sharp features and a no-nonsense demeanor. Her dark hair was pulled back into a ponytail, and her eyes, though warm, held a keen intensity. "Mike," she greeted, standing and shaking his hand firmly. "It's good to see you again." "You too, Lucy," Mike replied. He gestured to Thomas, who lingered in the doorway, clearly uncomfortable. "This is Thomas Langley." Lucy's gaze softened as she turned to Thomas, offering a hand. "Nice to meet you, Thomas." Thomas hesitated, then shook her hand briefly. "Yeah, you too." "Have a seat," Lucy said, gesturing to the chairs across from her desk. Thomas and Mike sat down, the boy's posture stiff as he glanced around the room. "So, Mike filled me in a little," Lucy began, folding her hands on the desk. "I know things have been tough for you and your family. I also know the system can feel like it's working against you more than it's working for you, but that's where I come in." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "And how's that?" Lucy smiled faintly. "I help people navigate the red tape, find the resources they need, fill out the paperwork, fight the battles when things don't go the way they should." "I've been there, Thomas. I know what it's like." Thomas shifted in his seat, his skepticism still apparent. "Why do you care? You don't even know us." "I don't have to know you to care," Lucy replied, her tone steady. "I care because someone cared about me when I needed it, and now I pay it forward." Thomas looked away, his jaw tightening. "I just don't want to waste my time," he muttered. "You won't be," Lucy said firmly. But this isn't just about me doing the work. It's about you, too. You're going to have to put in the effort. Meet me halfway." Mike watched the exchange, his admiration for Lucy growing. She was blunt but compassionate, and she seemed to understand exactly how to navigate Thomas's defenses without triggering his pride. "What's the first step?" Mike asked, breaking the tension. Lucy leaned back, her expression thoughtful. "We start small. Food assistance, utility help, those are quick wins. Then we work on the bigger stuff, medical care for your grandmother, maybe even job training programs for you." Thomas blinked, caught off guard. "Job training?" Lucy nodded. "You're smart. I can tell just from talking to you. There are programs that could help you get certified in something. Construction, plumbing, welding. Something that pays well." Thomas didn't respond, but the flicker of interest in his eyes didn't go unnoticed. "Think about it," Lucy said gently. "There's no rush. For now, let's focus on getting your family some immediate relief." They spent the next hour discussing options, Lucy walking them through forms and processes with a patience that impressed even Mike. Thomas remained guarded, but he engaged more as the conversation went on, his curiosity outweighing his skepticism. As they left the community center, Thomas was quiet, his gaze fixed on the folder of documents Lucy had given him. Mike watched him carefully, noting the way his grip tightened on the folder as though it were a lifeline. "She seems okay," Thomas said finally, his voice tentative. Mike smiled. "She's more than okay. She's in your corner now, just like me." Thomas glanced at him, his expression softer than it had been in days. "Thanks," he said quietly, "for not giving up." Mike's chest tightened at the words, but he simply nodded. "We're just getting started." As they walked back to the car, the sun broke through the clouds, bathing the quiet street in golden light. It felt like a small sign, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there was always the promise of something brighter ahead. Mike sat in his car outside the Langley home, his hands resting on the steering wheel. The morning was crisp, the frost on the grass glinting in the pale sunlight. He'd been here almost every day for the past week, helping Thomas navigate a system that seemed determined to work against them. But today felt different, charged with a tension he couldn't quite place. When he finally stepped out of the car, the front door opened, and Thomas emerged, his face tight with frustration. He carried a stack of papers, the edges curling slightly from being handled too many times. He waved them in the air as Mike approached. "They want more proof," Thomas said, his voice sharp with exasperation. "More bank statements, more medical records, more everything." Mike sighed, taking the papers from him and glancing through them. "It's not unusual," he said. "These programs are a maze, but we'll figure it out." Thomas crossed his arms, glaring at the ground. "What's the point? They're just going to keep asking for more until we give up." Mike met his gaze, his tone steady. "And are you going to give up?" Thomas hesitated, his jaw tightening. "No," he muttered. "Good," Mike said, handing the papers back, "because this is what it takes. It's not fair, and it's not easy, but it's worth it." Thomas nodded reluctantly, the fire in his eyes dimming but not extinguished. "Fine. What do we do next?" Mike smiled faintly. "We get what they're asking for, one step at a time." Inside, Eleanor was sitting in her usual spot by the window, a cup of tea cradled in her hands. She looked up as they entered, her expression softening when she saw the papers in Thomas's hand. "Another hurdle?" she asked, her voice gentle but weary. "Always," Thomas replied, setting the papers on the table. "They want proof of everything." Eleanor shook her head, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "They've been asking for proof my whole life, it seems. Proof we're poor enough, sick enough, desperate enough." Mike pulled out a chair and sat across from her, his tone thoughtful. "And that's the problem. The system isn't built to help. It's built to weed people out. But that's why we're here, to make sure you don't fall through the cracks." Eleanor nodded, her fingers tightening around the cup. "Thank you, Mike, for sticking with us." Mike nodded, his resolve hardening. "We're not done yet." Later that afternoon, Mike and Thomas found themselves back at the community center, seated at a long table piled with forms and folders. Lucy was pacing nearby, her brow furrowed as she scanned a document. "This," she said, pointing to a line on the page, "is what's holding things up. They want an official statement from your grandmother's doctor about her condition." Thomas groaned, slumping back in his chair. "She hasn't even seen a doctor in months. We can't afford it." Lucy set the paper down, her expression thoughtful. "There's a free clinic downtown. I can call them, see if they can squeeze her in this week." Thomas looked at her, his skepticism apparent. "And if they can't, then we figure something else out," Lucy said firmly. "But we're not stopping." Mike leaned forward, his tone gentle but insistent. "Thomas, I know this feels like a losing battle, but every step we take gets us closer. This isn't just about the paperwork. It's about showing them you're not giving up." Thomas ran a hand through his hair, his frustration palpable. "It just feels like no matter what we do, it's never enough." "It's enough because you're here," Lucy said, "because you're fighting for your family. That's what matters." Thomas didn't respond, but the tension in his posture eased slightly. He picked up the papers and began sorting through them, his movements slow but purposeful. By the time they returned to the Langley home, the sun was beginning to set, casting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Andy and Joey were playing in the yard, their laughter a welcome reprieve from the day's challenges. Eleanor was at the door when they arrived, her face lighting up at the sight of them. "Good news?" she asked, her tone hopeful. "Not yet," Mike replied, setting his bag on the table, "but we're getting there." Eleanor nodded, her gaze lingering on Thomas. "You're doing good, Thomas," she said softly. "Your mum and dad would be proud." Thomas looked away, his jaw tightening. "It doesn't feel like it," he muttered. Mike stepped closer, his voice firm but kind. "It's not about feeling like it, Thomas. It's about doing it." "And you are?" Thomas nodded slowly, his shoulders relaxing just a fraction. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I guess." Eleanor smiled, her eyes glistening. "That's my boy." Mike stayed a little longer that evening, helping Andy and Joey build a fort out of old blankets and chairs, while Eleanor and Thomas talked quietly in the kitchen. As he watched the boys laugh and play, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. When he finally left, the stars were just beginning to appear in the darkening sky. The road ahead was still long, and the obstacles were far from over. But for the first time, Mike felt confident they could face them, together. The morning sun was weak, shrouded by heavy clouds that threatened rain as Mike made his way back to the Langley home. The car ride was quiet, the hum of the engine doing little to drown out his thoughts. Today, he had news, small progress in the uphill battle they were fighting, but he wasn't sure how Thomas would take it. Victories like these, though meaningful, often felt hollow in the shadow of the larger challenges still looming. When he pulled into the driveway, Andy and Joey were already outside, bundled in oversized jackets as they kicked a soccer ball back and forth. They waved enthusiastically when they saw him, their smiles bright despite the biting wind. Mike waved back, his chest tightening at the sight of their unguarded joy. Children were resilient in ways adults often forgot. Inside, the house was quieter. Eleanor was seated in her usual spot by the window, a blanket wrapped around her frail shoulders. She looked up as Mike entered, her tired face lighting up with a warm smile. "Mike," she greeted, her voice soft but steady. "Good to see you." "Morning, Eleanor," he replied, setting his bag down on the table. "How are you feeling today?" She shrugged lightly, her smile fading but her tone resolute. "The same as always. But I'm here, and that's what counts." Mike nodded, admiration flickering in his chest. Eleanor's quiet strength reminded him of his late wife, Ida's Mary, how she had faced her own battles with unwavering dignity. He was about to respond when Thomas appeared from the hallway, his expression guarded as always. "What's the news?" Thomas asked, cutting straight to the point. Mike gestured for him to sit at the table. "It's not much," he admitted, pulling out a folder. "But it's something. The clinic Lucy contacted is willing to see your grandma next week. They'll do a full assessment, and it won't cost you anything." Eleanor's face softened with relief, but Thomas's brow furrowed. "Next week," he repeated, his voice tinged with frustration. "She needs help now." "I know," Mike said gently, "but this is how the system works, slow and full of hoops to jump through. The important thing is that we've got our foot in the door. Once she's in, it'll open up more options." Thomas leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. "And what about everything else? The bills, food? We're still drowning, Mike." Mike took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "One step at a time, Thomas. I know it's hard, but we're making progress. You've held things together this long. You can hold on a little longer." Thomas's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he looked away, his frustration simmering just beneath the surface. Mike could see the weight of responsibility pressing down on him, threatening to buckle his resolve. Eleanor reached over and placed a hand on Thomas's arm. "It's a start," she said softly, "and we're lucky to have it." Thomas glanced at her, his expression softening slightly, though his tension didn't fully ease. "Yeah," he muttered. "I guess." Later that afternoon, Lucy arrived with another stack of paperwork and a bag of groceries from the community center. She greeted everyone warmly, her presence like a gust of fresh air in the cramped house. As she unpacked the groceries, she chatted easily with Andy and Joey, who hovered nearby, their curiosity piqued by the unfamiliar items she brought. Thomas watched from the kitchen doorway, his arms crossed as usual. "You really go all out for this, don't you?" he said, his tone laced with both curiosity and a hint of skepticism. Lucy straightened, brushing her hands off on her jeans. "I do what I can," she replied simply. "Families like yours deserve a fighting chance," Thomas scoffed, shaking his head. "Doesn't feel like we're winning." "Winning doesn't always look the way you think it will," Lucy said, her voice firm but kind. "Sometimes it's just about holding on long enough to see the next opportunity." Mike, who had been silently observing, stepped forward. "Lucy's right," he said. "Every step forward is a win. It might not feel like it now, but these little victories add up." Thomas didn't respond, but his shoulders relaxed slightly. Lucy gave him a small smile before turning her attention to the paperwork. "We've got a few more forms to fill out," she said, setting them on the table. "Once these are done, we can apply for a housing grant. It won't solve everything, but it'll help with the rent for a few months." Thomas sighed, but sat down, picking up a pen. "Fine," he muttered. "Let's get it over with." Eleanor chuckled softly from her chair. "That's my boy," she said, her voice filled with quiet pride. "Always stubborn, but never one to back down." The comment drew a faint smile from Thomas, though he quickly masked it with a neutral expression. As he worked through the forms with Lucy's guidance, Mike felt a flicker of hope. It was fragile, like a flame struggling against the wind, but it was there. By the time Mike left that evening, the clouds had thickened and the first drops of rain began to fall. He pulled his jacket tighter around himself as he walked to his car, his thoughts swirling. Progress was being made, but the road ahead still felt impossibly long. As he drove home, he thought about Thomas, his frustration, his determination, and the quiet strength that reminded Mike of his younger self. He thought about Eleanor, her unwavering resolve despite her failing health, and he thought about Andy and Joey, their laughter a beacon of light in the darkness. The Langley family had a long way to go, but they weren't alone. And as Mike parked in his driveway, the rain tapping softly against the windshield, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. They would face the challenges ahead together, one fragile victory at a time. The rain fell steadily the next morning, a rhythmic patter against the windows of Mike's car as he drove toward the Langley home. The weather matched his mood, heavy, reflective, and tinged with unease. The past week had been a series of small gains, overshadowed by the enormity of the challenges still looming. Thomas's frustration, though subdued, simmered beneath every interaction, and Mike couldn't shake the sense that the boy was nearing a breaking point. When he arrived, the yard was empty, the rain driving Andy and Joey indoors. Mike knocked lightly, the sound muffled by the steady drizzle. It was Thomas who answered, his face set in a tight expression that immediately put Mike on edge. "What's wrong?" Mike asked as he stepped inside, shaking off the rain from his coat. Thomas didn't answer immediately, gesturing instead for Mike to follow him into the kitchen. The tension in the air was palpable, and Mike noticed Eleanor watching from her chair, her face drawn with concern. When they reached the table, Thomas slapped a crumpled letter down onto its surface. "This," he said, his voice tight with anger. Mike picked up the letter, smoothing it out. His eyes scanned the words quickly, his stomach sinking as he realized its contents. It was a notice of eviction, a final warning from the landlord. The rent was overdue again, and they were out of extensions. "They're giving us 2 weeks, Thomas said, his voice low but shaking. 2 weeks, and then we're out." Mike placed the letter back on the table carefully. "Did you know it was this bad?" he asked, his tone measured. Thomas shook his head, running a hand through his hair. "Grandma didn't want me to worry. She said she'd take care of it." He gestured toward the living room, frustration bleeding into his voice. "But how? She can't even leave the house." Mike glanced toward the doorway where Eleanor sat, her head bowed slightly as though she'd heard every word. "She was trying to protect you," he said gently. "She didn't want you to carry more than you already are." "Well, it didn't work," Thomas snapped, pacing the length of the kitchen. "Now we're worse off than before. What's the point of all this paperwork and phone calls if we're just going to end up on the street anyway?" Mike leaned back against the counter, crossing his arms. He let the boy's frustration fill the room, knowing from experience that sometimes it was better to let the storm pass before speaking. When Thomas finally stopped pacing, his breathing heavy, Mike spoke. "This is a setback," he said evenly. "But it's not the end. We still have time." "Time for what?" Thomas shot back. "To beg for more help that never comes, to watch everything fall apart while we wait." "To keep fighting," Mike said firmly, "because giving up isn't an option." Thomas glared at him, but the anger in his eyes was mixed with something else, fear, desperation, a plea for someone to tell him things would be okay. Mike took a step closer, his voice softening. "I know it feels hopeless," he said. "But we've made progress. The clinic appointment, the utility assistance, that's all because you didn't give up. And now we're going to figure this out too." Thomas dropped into a chair, his head in his hands. "I don't know how much more I can do," he muttered. "You're not doing it alone," Mike reminded him. "You've got Lucy, you've got me, and whether you believe it or not, you've got your grandma and your brothers too. You're not in this by yourself." The words hung in the air, their weight settling over both of them. Finally, Thomas looked up, his expression weary but less guarded. "What do we do now?" Mike nodded, glad to see the spark of resolve returning. "First, we talk to Lucy. She'll know what options we have. Then we go from there." The rain had eased into a drizzle by the time Mike and Thomas arrived at the community center. Lucy was waiting for them, her sharp eyes scanning the eviction notice as they explained the situation. She frowned, tapping her pen against the edge of her desk. "This isn't great," she admitted, "but it's not hopeless. There's an emergency housing fund we can apply for, and I know a few local charities that might be able to help with the immediate payment." Thomas shifted in his seat. "What if they say no?" "Then we keep trying," Lucy said firmly. "This isn't the first eviction notice I've dealt with, and it won't be the last. There's always a way forward." Thomas nodded reluctantly, the doubt in his eyes tempered by her confidence. Mike watched the interaction, a flicker of pride warming his chest. Lucy had a way of cutting through the noise, giving people just enough hope to keep moving. As they worked through the next steps, Mike felt a sense of renewed determination. The road ahead was still daunting, but Thomas was still in the fight, and as long as he was, so was Mike. Back at the Langley home, Eleanor waited in her chair, her eyes brightening as they walked through the door. Andy and Joey ran to greet them, their laughter filling the room with a welcome sense of normalcy. "Did you figure anything out?" Eleanor asked, her voice tinged with both hope and worry. "Not yet," Thomas replied, his tone softer than it had been earlier. "But we're working on it." Eleanor nodded, her gaze lingering on Mike. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for not giving up on us." Mike smiled, his resolve hardening. "We're not giving up, not now, not ever." As the rain finally stopped, a faint ray of sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the small house. It was a fragile moment of peace, but for Mike, It was enough to remind him why they were fighting. Together, they would face whatever came next, one step at a time. The Langley home felt heavier than usual the next morning. The air inside seemed thick with unspoken worries, each family member moving as if under the weight of an invisible burden. Mike arrived to find Thomas sitting on the porch steps, his head in his hands, the eviction notice crumpled beside him. "You look like you didn't sleep," Mike said, sitting down on the step beside him. Thomas didn't look up. "I didn't." The admission wasn't surprising. The previous day's conversations had stirred up everything Thomas had been trying to hold together, and Mike knew the boy was struggling to see a way out. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the neighborhood, birds chirping, a dog barking in the distance, filled the silence. "We have options," Mike said finally, his voice steady. "Lucy's making calls." "We're not out of moves yet." Thomas let out a bitter laugh, lifting his head to stare at the street. "It doesn't feel that way." Mike leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You're allowed to feel like this, you know. Angry, scared, overwhelmed. But you don't have to let it stop you." Thomas turned to him, his face etched with frustration. "You keep saying that, but what if it's not enough?" "What if I'm not enough?" The vulnerability in Thomas's voice hit Mike harder than he expected. For a moment, he saw himself in the boy, the younger version of himself who had struggled after his father's death, who had questioned whether he could carry the weight of his own family's survival. "You are," Mike said firmly, "but you don't have to do this alone. That's what we're here for. Me, Lucy, your grandmother, we're all in this with you." Thomas looked away, his jaw tightening. "I don't know how to believe that anymore." Before Mike could respond, the front door creaked open, and Eleanor appeared, her frail frame wrapped in a thick sweater. She looked at the two of them for a moment before stepping outside and lowering herself carefully onto the porch chair. "Thomas," she said, her voice soft but steady, "I know this feels like too much. I know you're scared, but you're stronger than you think. You always have been." Thomas shook his head, his frustration breaking into his words. "And look where that's gotten us. I've been strong, and we're still here. Still broke, still fighting to keep a roof over our heads." Eleanor didn't flinch, her gaze steady as she spoke. "Because life isn't about being strong all the time. It's about finding a way to keep going, even when you feel like you can't. And you have, Thomas? You've kept this family together when no one else could?" The raw emotion in her voice hung in the air, settling over them. Thomas wiped at his face roughly, his hands trembling. "I'm just so tired," he said, his voice cracking. "I don't know how much more I can take." Mike placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder, his grip firm. "That's why we're here, to take some of that weight off you. But you have to let us." Thomas nodded slowly, the tension in his body easing just slightly. He looked between Mike and his grandmother, his expression a mix of exhaustion and faint hope. "Okay," he said quietly. "What's the next step?" By mid-afternoon, Lucy had called with an update. She'd found a local charity willing to cover part of the overdue rent if they could secure the remaining balance. It was a lifeline, but one that required swift action. Mike and Thomas drove to the community center where Lucy was waiting, her desk piled high with folders and forms. "This is good news," Lucy said, sliding a form across the desk toward Thomas. "But we need everything finalized by tomorrow. That means proof of income, what little there is, and a signed agreement from the landlord." Thomas frowned, his skepticism returning. "You really think the landlord's going to agree to this?" Lucy leaned back in her chair, her expression calm but determined. "I've dealt with him before. He's not unreasonable. If he sees we're serious about resolving this, he'll cooperate." Thomas picked up the pen, his movements deliberate as he filled out the form. Mike watched him carefully, noticing the subtle shift in his demeanor. The anger and frustration were still there, but so was something else: focus, determination. When they finished, Lucy stood and handed the folder to Mike. "You take this to the landlord," she said. "He's more likely to listen to you." Mike nodded, taking the folder. "I'll handle it." Thomas looked at him, his voice hesitant. "What if he says no?" Mike met his gaze, his tone steady. "Then we figure out another way. But let's not assume the worst until we get there." The meeting with the landlord was tense, but productive. The man, a wiry figure with a sharp nose and a calculating gaze, agreed to the arrangement reluctantly. He scribbled his signature on the agreement, muttering about making an exception, but Mike didn't care about the commentary. He left with the signed papers in hand, a small victory in a battle that felt endless. When he returned to the Langley home that evening, the atmosphere had shifted. The tension was still there, but it was tempered by a cautious optimism. Thomas met him at the door, his expression unreadable as Mike handed him the signed agreement. "We've got a shot," Mike said simply. Thomas stared at the paper for a long moment before nodding. "Thanks," he said quietly. Then, after a pause, he added, "For everything." Mike smiled faintly. "We're not done yet." As he left, the first stars began to appear in the evening sky. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time in days, Mike felt like they'd taken a meaningful step forward, and that, he realized, was enough to keep going. The following day brought a rare sense of anticipation to the Langley home. Thomas was up before sunrise, pacing the living room while the rest of the house stirred slowly to life. Mike arrived just as the sun broke through the lingering morning fog, casting a pale light over the patchy yard. The sight of Thomas standing at the window, arms crossed, reminded him of a soldier preparing for battle. When Mike knocked, Thomas opened the door immediately, his face a mixture of determination and tension. "You've got the papers?" he asked, skipping any pleasantries. Mike held up the folder. "Signed and ready. Lucy's waiting for us at the community center to finalize everything." Thomas exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "Okay," he said, stepping aside to let Mike in. "Let me grab my stuff." Inside, the house hummed with quiet activity. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, sipping tea and flipping through an old photo album. Joey and Andy were in the corner, whispering to each other as they worked on a puzzle. The air, though still heavy with the weight of uncertainty, felt lighter than it had in days. Eleanor looked up as Mike entered, her face softening into a faint smile. "Morning, Mike," she said. "I hear today's an important one." "It is," Mike replied, setting the folder on the table. "If everything goes well, we'll have this eviction notice sorted out." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Thomas won't say it, but he's grateful. We all are. You've done more for us than I think you realize." Mike smiled faintly, the warmth in her words cutting through the doubt that had lingered at the edges of his mind. "We're in this together," he said simply. Thomas returned a moment later, his jacket slung over one shoulder. "Ready?" he said curtly, his tone clipped but lacking its usual edge. Mike nodded, picking up the folder. "Let's get to it." The ride to the community center was quiet, the tension between them no longer born of distrust, but of shared purpose. Thomas stared out the window, his jaw set as the town passed by in a blur of storefronts and leafless trees. When they arrived, Lucy was waiting in the main office, her desk cluttered with stacks of papers and folders. She looked up as they walked in, her sharp eyes immediately scanning the folder Mike handed her. "Looks good," she said after a moment, flipping through the pages. "We've got everything we need to submit the housing grant application. Now it's just a matter of waiting." Thomas frowned, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "How long?" "A week, maybe 2, Lucy replied. "But with the eviction notice, we'll request expedited processing. They'll prioritize it." Thomas didn't look reassured, his brow furrowing. "And if they don't?" "They will," Lucy said firmly. "I'll make sure of it." Her confidence seemed to settle Thomas slightly, though his unease didn't fully fade. Mike stepped forward, his tone calm. "This is a big step, Thomas. I know waiting is hard, but we've done everything we can. Now it's up to them." Thomas nodded reluctantly, his posture still tense. "Yeah, I guess." Lucy leaned back in her chair, studying him. "You've come a long way, Thomas. Whether you see it or not, this is a win." The words seemed to catch Thomas off guard. He glanced at her, then at Mike, his expression softening. "It doesn't feel like it," he admitted quietly. "Not yet." "Give it time," Lucy said with a small smile. "Wins like this don't always feel big at first, but they add up." That afternoon, back at the Langley home, the atmosphere felt lighter. Andy and Joey ran around the yard, their laughter carrying through the open windows. Eleanor sat in her chair, a book open on her lap, though her gaze often drifted toward the sounds of her grandsons playing. Thomas, however, remained in the kitchen, staring at the eviction notice, now pinned under a paperweight on the table. He traced the edges of the paper with his finger, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. "You did good today," Mike said, breaking the silence as he stepped into the room. Thomas looked up, his expression conflicted. "It doesn't feel like enough." Mike pulled out a chair and sat down across from him. "Because it's not the end, but it's a step. And steps like this, they're what get you to the other side." Thomas leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. "It just feels like there's always something else." "Another hurdle, another fight." Mike nodded, his gaze steady. "There is. That's life, Thomas. But the way you're handling it, that's what matters." Thomas didn't reply immediately, his jaw working as he processed the words. "I don't know how you do it," he said finally. "Keep pushing, even when it feels like it's all falling apart." Mike's expression softened. "Because I've been there, and I know what it's like to feel like the whole world's against you. But I also know it doesn't stay that way forever. You just have to keep moving." Thomas's eyes met his, a flicker of understanding passing between them. "Thanks," he said quietly, "for not giving up." Mike smiled, the words hitting him with a weight he hadn't expected. "Any time." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of orange and pink, the Langley home felt, for the first time in weeks, like it could be a place of peace. The challenges ahead hadn't disappeared, but they felt less insurmountable. Together, they had taken a step forward, a small triumph, but one that carried the promise of more to come. And for Mike, that was enough to keep going. The Langley home sat in a quiet lull the next morning, the kind of stillness that stretched between hope and anxiety. Eleanor was in her usual chair by the window, her knitting needles moving rhythmically despite the tremor in her hands. Andy and Joey were sprawled on the living room floor, whispering conspiratorially over a new puzzle, their giggles occasionally breaking the silence. Mike arrived to find Thomas sitting on the porch steps again, staring out at the empty street as though expecting answers to materialize from the horizon. "You've got that look again," Mike said as he climbed the steps. "The one that says you've been thinking too much." Thomas smirked faintly, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Can you blame me?" Mike sat beside him, the wooden step creaking under his weight. "No," he admitted, "but I can remind you that worrying doesn't make time move faster." Thomas leaned back, exhaling sharply. "It's not just the waiting. It's the not knowing. We've done everything, jumped through every hoop, and it still feels like it's out of my hands." Mike nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the patchy grass in the yard. "That's the hardest part, isn't it? Letting go of what you can't control." Thomas glanced at him, his expression softening slightly. "You ever feel like that? Like you're just stuck?" "All the time," Mike replied honestly, "but I've learned that being stuck doesn't mean you're not moving." Sometimes the progress is just harder to see. Thomas didn't respond immediately, his jaw tightening as he processed the words. Finally, he sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. I just want it to be over. I want to know we're going to be okay. Mike placed a hand on his shoulder, his grip firm. You will be, he said quietly. One way or another, you'll get through this. And when you do, you'll be stronger for it. Thomas nodded reluctantly, the tension in his posture easing just slightly. I hope you're right. Inside, Eleanor looked up as they entered, her face lighting up with a tired but genuine smile. Morning, Mike, she greeted, her knitting needles pausing mid-stitch. How's it looking out there? Quiet, Mike replied, pulling out a chair at the kitchen table. Thomas and I were just talking about patience. Eleanor chuckled softly, her eyes crinkling at the corners. Not one of his strong suits, I'm afraid. Thomas rolled his eyes as he leaned against the counter, but a faint smile tugged at his lips. I get it from you. Eleanor arched an eyebrow. Oh, do you now? I seem to recall being very patient when you were a boy, especially when you decided to paint the living room walls with mud. Andy perked up from his spot on the floor, his eyes wide. You did that, Thomas groaned, running a hand over his face. It was one time, and I was like 6. 5, Eleanor corrected, her tone teasing. And you were very proud of your art. The room filled with soft laughter, the tension that had hung over the morning dissipating like smoke. Even Thomas couldn't help but smile, the memory pulling him momentarily out of his worry. Mike leaned back in his chair, the warmth of the moment settling over him. Sometimes, it's the little things that keep you going, he said, even if they're messy. Eleanor nodded, her knitting needles resuming their steady rhythm. Ain't that the truth? Later that afternoon, Mike suggested they take a break from the house. The walls, though filled with memories, were beginning to feel like a cage for Thomas, who seemed restless despite his attempts to stay busy. They drove into town, the familiar streets quieter than usual under the grey sky. Mike parked outside a small cafe, the kind of place where the scent of freshly brewed coffee and baked goods lingered in the air, like an unspoken promise of comfort. They took a corner table, the hum of quiet conversations and the clink of mugs providing a soothing backdrop. As they sipped their drinks, Mike leaned forward, his tone casual. What's the first thing you're going to do when this is all sorted? Thomas blinked, the question catching him off guard. He set his mug down, thinking for a moment. I don't know, he admitted. I haven't thought that far ahead. Why not? Mike asked, his gaze steady. It's important to have something to look forward to, something that reminds you what you're fighting for. Thomas hesitated, then shrugged. I guess I'd take my brother somewhere nice, somewhere they can just be kids for a day. Mike smiled, his chest tightening at the honesty in Thomas's voice. That's a good plan. What about you? Thomas asked, his tone tentative. What do you look forward to? Mike leaned back, his expression thoughtful. To be honest, I haven't thought about it much. I've been so focused on this, on helping you, that I haven't given myself the space to think about what comes next. Thomas studied him, his brow furrowing slightly. Why do you do it? Help us. I mean, you could have walked away 100 times by now. Mike met his gaze, his voice steady. Because it matters. Because you matter, and because I know what it's like to feel like the world's against you. If I can make it even a little easier for you, then it's worth it. The sincerity in his words seemed to reach Thomas, who nodded slowly. Thanks, he said quietly, for sticking around. Mike smiled, the moment solidifying the bond they'd built over the past few weeks. Any time. As they returned to the Langley home, the clouds began to part, revealing patches of blue sky. The small house, though weathered, stood resilient against the changing light. For the first time in days, it felt like more than just a place of worry. It felt like a home on the verge of hope. The waiting wasn't over, but as Mike watched Thomas step inside, his shoulders no longer weighed down by doubt, he knew they were closer than ever to the other side. And that, for now, was enough. The afternoon sky shifted abruptly as Mike parked his car in front of the Langley home. Dark clouds rolled in from the west, heavy with the promise of a storm. The wind carried the smell of rain and something sharp, like ozone. Mike grabbed his coat from the passenger seat, his thoughts lingering on the fragile calm they'd managed to achieve in the past few days. He knew from experience that calm was often the prelude to a storm, both in weather and in life. Thomas was already outside, his brow furrowed as he secured a loose piece of tarp over the shed in the backyard. The wind tugged at the fabric, and Mike saw him struggle, his movements quick and frustrated. He walked over, offering a steadying hand. "Looks like the weather's turning on us," Mike said, grabbing a corner of the tarp. "Yeah," Thomas muttered, his tone clipped. "Feels about right." Mike glanced at him, noting the tension in his posture. "Something on your mind?" Thomas hesitated, then shook his head. "It's nothing." "Doesn't look like nothing," Mike replied, securing the tarp before stepping back. "Talk to me." Thomas sighed, shoving his hands into his pockets. "It's just this waiting. It's driving me crazy." And now Grandma's coughing more. Joey says his shoes are falling apart, and Andy's been asking if we're going to have to move. I don't know how to keep telling them it's going to be fine when I don't even believe it myself. Mike nodded, letting the words settle between them before responding. "It's a lot to carry, Thomas, but you don't have to do it all at once. Focus on what's in front of you. The rest will come." Thomas looked at him, his frustration flickering into something softer. "That's easier said than done." "I know," Mike said gently, "but you've made it this far. That says something." Before Thomas could respond, a loud clap of thunder rolled across the sky, cutting through the tension. The first drops of rain began to fall, fat and cold. They hurried back to the house, the wind pushing at their backs. Inside, the house was warm, the smell of something cooking filling the small kitchen. Eleanor stood by the stove, stirring a pot of soup. She turned when they entered, her smile faint but genuine. "Caught in the rain?" she asked, her voice rasping slightly. "Not quite," Mike replied, hanging his coat on the back of a chair. "Looks like it's going to be a rough one, though." Eleanor nodded, her gaze drifting to the window. "Seems fitting. Storms always come when you least expect them." Mike glanced at Thomas, who had taken a seat at the table, his head resting in his hands. "Sometimes they clear the way for something better," Mike offered. Eleanor smiled faintly, but her eyes held a distant sadness. "Let's hope so." As they ate, the storm outside grew louder. The wind howled, rattling the windows, and the rain drummed steadily on the roof. Andy and Joey stayed close to the table, their usual chatter subdued. Even Thomas, who often wore his frustration like armor, seemed quieter than usual, his eyes fixed on the flickering light above the table. "I hate storms," Andy said suddenly, his voice small. Joey nodded, scooting closer to his brother. "Me too." Eleanor reached out, her frail hand resting on Andy's shoulder. "Storms don't last forever," she said gently. "They're loud and scary, but they always pass." Mike leaned forward, his voice steady. "Your grandma's right, and you've got a strong house here, strong people. Nothing's going to get through that." Andy glanced at him, his wide eyes searching for reassurance. "You promise?" Mike nodded firmly. "I promise." The hours stretched on, the storm refusing to ease. The power flickered once, then twice, before going out completely. Eleanor lit a few candles. their warm glow casting dancing shadows across the walls. The boys huddled together on the couch, a blanket draped over their laps. Thomas stood by the window, staring out into the rain. "It's going to be fine," Mike said quietly as he joined him. Thomas glanced at him, his jaw tightening. "I know, it feels like everything's out of control, like no matter what I do, it's not enough." Mike placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're doing more than you realize, Thomas. For your brothers, for your grandmother, they see it even if you don't." Thomas nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on the storm. "I just wish it didn't feel like we're always waiting for the next bad thing to happen." Mike's chest tightened at the words, but he kept his voice steady. "That's life sometimes. But you don't have to face it alone. And it won't always be like this. You've got people who care, who are willing to fight alongside you." Thomas didn't respond, but the tension in his shoulders seemed to ease. They stood in silence for a while, watching as the storm began to shift, the rain lessening and the wind calming. By the time the storm passed, the house had settled into an exhausted quiet. Andy and Joey had fallen asleep on the couch, their soft breathing a reminder of the innocence that still clung to them despite everything. Eleanor sat nearby, her eyes closed, the candlelight softening the lines of her face. Thomas was the last to turn in, lingering in the kitchen as Mike prepared to leave. He hesitated by the door, his expression unreadable. "Thanks," he said finally, his voice low, "for being here." Mike met his gaze, his own voice equally quiet. "Always." As he stepped out into the cool night air, the storm gone but its presence still lingering, Mike felt a flicker of hope. The road ahead was still uncertain, but the bonds they were building, the resilience they were finding in one another, they were enough to weather whatever came next. The morning after the storm dawned crisp and clear, the air fresh with the scent of wet earth. The Langley home sat in a kind of quiet stillness, as though recovering from the tension of the previous night. Mike arrived just as Thomas was finishing with the yard, gathering the scattered branches the storm had left in its wake. "You've been busy," Mike remarked, stepping out of his car. Thomas shrugged, tossing a branch onto a growing pile near the edge of the yard. "Keeps me from thinking too much." Mike nodded, walking over to help. "Not a bad way to handle it." They worked side by side for a while, the silence between them comfortable. As they gathered the last of the debris, Thomas finally spoke. "Lucy called this morning," he said, his tone neutral. "The grant went through." Mike looked at him, his brows lifting in surprise. "That's good news." "Yeah," Thomas replied, though his voice lacked the enthusiasm Mike had expected. He brushed his hands off on his jeans, avoiding Mike's gaze. "It's just one thing off a list that keeps getting longer." Mike placed a hand on his shoulder, his grip firm. "One thing is still progress. Don't lose sight of that." Thomas nodded but didn't reply, his expression unreadable. Inside the house, Eleanor was seated at the kitchen table, a notebook open in front of her. She looked up as they entered, her face lighting up faintly. "Mike," she greeted warmly, "you're just in time. I was going over some numbers." Mike pulled out a chair and sat down across from her, glancing at the neatly written columns in the notebook. "Budgeting. Trying to," she said with a tired smile. "I'm not sure how much good it'll do, but I figure it's better to have a plan than not." Mike nodded, his admiration for her quiet determination growing. "That's a good mindset." Thomas leaned against the counter, watching the exchange with an intensity that suggested he had something on his mind. Finally, he spoke, his voice quieter than usual. "We're making progress, right?" he asked, though it sounded more like a plea than a question. Eleanor looked up at him, her gaze soft but firm. "We are, Thomas. It might not feel like it yet, but every little bit helps." Thomas rubbed the back of his neck, his frustration flickering just beneath the surface. It just feels like we're treading water, like no matter what we do, we're one bad break away from sinking. Mike leaned forward, his voice steady. That's how it feels sometimes. But the important thing is that you're still moving, you're still fighting. Thomas met his gaze, his jaw tightening. What happens if we can't keep fighting? You will, Eleanor said firmly, her tone leaving no room for doubt. Because you always do. You're stronger than you think, Thomas. You always have been. The words seemed to strike something deep in Thomas, and he looked away, his shoulders slumping slightly. Later that afternoon, Lucy stopped by with another stack of papers, her expression serious but not unkind. She spread the documents out on the table, walking them through the next steps for the housing assistance and the upcoming clinic visit for Eleanor. This is all good progress, she said, her tone encouraging, but we need to stay on top of it. That means keeping records of everything, receipts, bills, anything they might ask for. Eleanor nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of the notebook she'd been working on. I can do that. Lucy glanced at Thomas, her gaze steady. And you need to keep focusing on your brothers. Stability starts with them feeling secure. Thomas frowned but nodded. I'm trying. You're doing more than trying, Mike added, his voice firm. You're doing it. Thomas glanced at him, his expression softening slightly. Yeah, he said quietly. Thanks. As the day wore on, the house seemed to settle into a rare rhythm of calm. Andy and Joey played outside, their laughter echoing through the open windows. Eleanor worked quietly on her budget, her pen moving steadily across the page. Even Thomas, though still restless, seemed lighter than he had in days. Mike stayed longer than usual, helping Eleanor organize her documents and playing a round of cards with the boys. By the time the sun began to set, casting the yard in hues of gold and orange, he felt a sense of accomplishment. Not just for the tangible progress they'd made, but for the small, fragile hope that seemed to be taking root in the family. As he prepared to leave, Thomas followed him to the porch. The evening air was cool, carrying the faint scent of the storm that had passed. For a moment, they stood in silence, watching as the last light faded from the sky. Thanks, Thomas said finally, his voice low. For everything. Mike turned to him, his expression serious. You don't have to thank me, Thomas. We're in this together. Thomas nodded, his gaze distant. Still, it helps. Having someone here. It makes it easier to believe things might actually get better. Mike smiled faintly, his chest tightening at the honesty in Thomas's words. They will. You've just got to keep holding on. As Mike walked to his car, the weight of the day lingered with him, but so did a renewed sense of purpose. The Langley family still had a long road ahead, but they weren't walking it alone. And for Mike, that made all the difference. The next morning, the Langley household stirred early, the faint buzz of activity signaling a sense of purpose. Eleanor was already in the kitchen, the smell of coffee wafting through the air as she shuffled through her growing stack of paperwork. Andy and Joey sat cross-legged on the living room floor, surrounded by crayons and scraps of paper, their laughter an occasional spark of life in the otherwise subdued atmosphere. Thomas, however, was restless. He stood by the front window, his arms crossed as he stared at the street. When Mike's car pulled into the driveway, Thomas let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Mike stepped out, carrying a bag in one hand and a folder tucked under his arm. The crisp morning air seemed to energize him, his steps purposeful as he approached the house. Thomas opened the door before he could knock. "You're early," Thomas said, his tone hovering between surprise and relief. "Figured we'd get a head start," Mike replied, stepping inside and setting the bag on the kitchen table. Brought breakfast. Thought you could use a break from toast and cereal." Eleanor looked up, her eyes brightening. "Mike, you're spoiling us," she said with a faint smile. "Just making sure you're fueled for the day," he replied, pulling out a container of pastries and a thermos of fresh coffee. As the family settled around the table, the conversation turned to their plans. Lucy had called the night before, reminding them of the clinic appointment for Eleanor later that week and outlining the next steps for the housing grant. "Feels like we're juggling a dozen things at once," Eleanor said, her tone light but with an undercurrent of exhaustion. Mike nodded. "That's how it feels sometimes. But you're handling it better than most." Eleanor smiled faintly, but her attention was drawn to Thomas, who was unusually quiet. "What's on your mind, Thomas?" she asked gently. Thomas hesitated, then shook his head. "Just thinking." Eleanor's gaze lingered on him for a moment before she turned back to her coffee. Mike watched the exchange, making a mental note to check in with Thomas later. The morning unfolded in its usual rhythm, the family finding small ways to fill the hours while they waited for Lucy to drop off the next round of paperwork. The sound of the doorbell mid-morning broke the quiet, and Thomas opened the door to find an unfamiliar face on the porch. The man standing there was tall and wiry, his weathered face framed by salt and pepper hair. He wore a clean but well-worn jacket, his hands shoved into the pockets. His expression was hesitant, almost cautious. "Thomas?" the man asked, his voice low. Thomas froze, his eyes narrowing. "Who are you?" The man shifted his weight, his posture uneasy. "Name's Ethan. I'm a friend of your dad's. I've been out of town for a while, but I just heard about what happened." Thomas's grip on the door tightened. "That was over 2 years ago." "I know," Ethan said quickly, "and I'm sorry. I should have been here sooner." "But I'm here now, and I want to help." Thomas stared at him, his face unreadable. "Why now? Why not back then, when we actually needed someone?" Ethan's shoulders sagged slightly, his guilt palpable. "I don't have a good answer for that," he admitted, "but I heard you were in trouble, and I wanted to see if there was anything I could do." The tension in the doorway was thick, and Mike, sensing something was wrong, stepped forward. "Everything okay?" he asked, his tone calm but firm. Thomas glanced back at Mike, then stepped aside reluctantly. "This is Ethan," he said curtly. "Apparently, he knew my dad." Ethan offered Mike a hesitant nod. "I didn't mean to intrude. I wanted to check in." Mike studied the man, his instincts on high alert. "What kind of help are you offering?" "Anything I can," Ethan said. "I've got some contacts in town, people who might be able to speed things up with the housing or the clinic. I figured it couldn't hurt to try." Thomas crossed his arms, his skepticism clear. "And what do you get out of this?" Ethan met his gaze, his expression earnest. "Nothing. I owe it to your dad. He was a good man, and I should have been there for his family." The weight of his words hung in the air, and for a moment, the only sound was the soft hum of the heater in the background. Finally, Eleanor's voice broke the silence. "Thomas," she said softly, her tone firm but kind. "Sometimes help comes when you least expect it. Don't let anger make you turn it away." Thomas looked at her, his jaw tightening. Then, with a reluctant nod, he stepped back. "Fine," he said, "but don't expect me to trust you right away." Ethan nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "That's fair." The rest of the day felt strange, the unexpected arrival of Ethan adding a new layer of complexity to their already tenuous situation. Mike watched him closely, his gut telling him there was more to the man's story than he was letting on, but for now, he decided to let it play out, trusting his instincts to guide him if things went sideways. As the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting the house in warm golden light, Mike prepared to leave. Thomas walked him to the door, his expression unreadable. "You think he's legit?" Thomas asked quietly, nodding toward the living room where Ethan sat talking with Eleanor. Mike hesitated, then nodded. "I think he means well, but keep your guard up." Thomas smirked faintly. "Already there." Mike placed a hand on his shoulder, his grip firm. "Whatever happens, you got people in your corner. Don't forget that." Thomas nodded, his gaze steady. "I won't." As Mike stepped into the cool evening air, he felt the weight of the day settle over him. The arrival of Ethan had stirred something in the Langley household, hope, perhaps, or unease. Either way, it was clear that the road ahead had just taken another unexpected turn. And for Mike, that meant staying vigilant, ready to guide them through whatever came next. The following day was overcast, the sky heavy with low-hanging clouds that muted the winter sunlight. Mike arrived at the Langley home later than usual, delayed by a long phone call with Lucy about the next steps for Eleanor's medical appointments. When he stepped onto the porch, he could feel the tension in the air even before he knocked. Thomas opened the door, his face unreadable but his posture stiff. "He's still here," he said, his tone clipped. "Ethan?" Mike asked. Thomas nodded, stepping aside to let him in. The faint hum of conversation drifted from the living room, where Ethan sat with Eleanor, his voice low and steady. Eleanor seemed more animated than usual, gesturing as she spoke, her face showing a mixture of relief and curiosity. Mike followed Thomas into the kitchen, where the younger man leaned against the counter, arms crossed tightly over his chest. "He's making himself comfortable," Thomas muttered, his frustration clear. Mike poured himself a cup of coffee, taking a moment to gauge the situation. "What's he been saying?" Thomas shrugged, though the movement was tense. "Talking about connections he has, things he can do to help. But I don't get why he's here now." "Why not when things first went south?" Mike nodded slowly, understanding the skepticism. "It's a fair question, but if he can actually help, maybe it's worth hearing him out." Thomas's jaw tightened. "I don't trust him." Mike leaned against the counter, meeting his gaze. "You don't have to. Not yet. But keeping him at arm's length doesn't mean shutting him out completely. Sometimes people show up late for good reasons." Thomas hesitated, then exhaled sharply. "I just don't want him filling Grandma's head with promises he can't keep." Mike placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "That's why I'm here. Let's see what he has to say." The living room was warm, the soft glow of a lamp casting a cozy light over the space. Eleanor smiled when she saw Mike, motioning for him to sit. Ethan rose to shake his hand, his grip firm but not overbearing. "Mike, right," Ethan said. "Thomas mentioned you. Thanks for everything you're doing for this family." "Just doing my part," Mike replied evenly, taking a seat across from him. "Thomas tells me you knew his dad." Ethan nodded, his expression somber. "We grew up together, best friends since grade school. Losing him, that hit hard." Eleanor reached out, placing a frail hand on Ethan's arm. "I remember you from the early days. You and Jim were inseparable." Ethan smiled faintly, though a shadow passed over his face. "We were. And I should have been here after he was gone. I wasn't, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life." Mike studied him, noting the genuine emotion in his voice. "What brings you back now?" Ethan met his gaze, his expression steady. "I heard through a mutual friend about what's been going on. The eviction, Eleanor's health. I couldn't just stay away. I've got connections in town, people who owe me favors. I thought I could help." Eleanor smiled faintly. "It's good to see you again, Ethan. And if you can help, we'd be grateful. But you should know we've come a long way already, thanks to Mike and Lucy." Ethan nodded. "I don't doubt it. I'm not here to take over, just to add what I can." Mike leaned forward slightly, his tone measured. You mentioned connections. What kind of help are we talking about? Financial, mostly, Ethan said. I know someone who runs a local charity. They specialize in emergency housing and medical expenses. If I make the call, they'll prioritize your case. Eleanor's eyes brightened, but Thomas, standing in the doorway, scoffed softly. Convenient, he muttered. Ethan turned to him, his expression steady but not defensive. You've got every right to be skeptical, Thomas. I would be too. But I'm not asking you to trust me right away. Let me show you I mean what I say. Thomas crossed his arms, his gaze hard. Fine, but if you mess this up... I won't, Ethan interrupted, his tone calm but firm. The tension in the room was thick, but Eleanor broke it with a soft chuckle. Men and their posturing, she said, shaking her head. Let's focus on what matters. Mike smiled faintly, appreciating her ability to cut through the tension. Ethan, if you can get us that meeting, it'd be a step in the right direction. I'll call them tonight, Ethan said. We'll set it up for tomorrow. The rest of the day passed in a strange mix of hope and unease. Thomas remained distant, his suspicion of Ethan unwavering. Eleanor, on the other hand, seemed buoyed by the idea of additional help, her energy returning in small but noticeable ways. By evening, Mike found himself back in the kitchen with Thomas, the two of them sharing a quiet moment over cups of coffee. The sound of Andy and Joey playing upstairs filled the silence. You really think he's legit? Thomas asked, his voice low. Mike took a sip of his coffee, his expression thoughtful. I think he's trying. Whether that's enough, we'll see. But I don't think he's here to hurt you. Thomas stared into his mug, his jaw tightening. I just don't want to let my guard down and regret it. You're not letting your guard down, Mike said gently. You're giving someone a chance. There's a difference. Thomas nodded slowly, though his expression remained wary. I guess we'll see. Mike placed a hand on his shoulder, the gesture firm but reassuring. You've got this, Thomas, and you've got people who've got your back. As he left that evening, the clouds overhead began to part, revealing a faint sliver of moonlight. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a while, it felt like they were gaining momentum. And for Mike, that was enough to keep moving forward. The day began with an unusual quietness in the Langley home. The morning light filtered through the windows, illuminating the living room where Andy and Joey were quietly building a Lego tower. Eleanor sat nearby, her knitting needles moving rhythmically, though her eyes often drifted toward the door. Thomas had been restless since sunrise, pacing between the kitchen and the porch, his irritation barely contained. When Mike arrived, he found Thomas outside, arms crossed as he leaned against the railing. The sharp chill in the air mirrored the tension in his posture. You look like you've been up all night, Mike said, stepping onto the porch. Thomas shrugged, his eyes fixed on the street. Couldn't sleep. Mike waited, sensing there was more. Finally, Thomas spoke, his voice low but edged with frustration. Ethan's supposed to call today about the meeting. Said he'd have everything lined up by now. And he hasn't? Mike asked. Thomas shook his head. Nope, and I'm starting to think he won't. Mike leaned against the railing beside him, his tone calm. It's still early. Let's give him the benefit of the doubt. Thomas shot him a skeptical look, but didn't argue. Instead, he shoved his hands into his pockets and muttered, We'll see. Inside, the mood was lighter. Joey and Andy had moved their Lego project to the kitchen table, proudly showing off their progress to Eleanor, who offered soft words of encouragement. When Mike joined them, Eleanor glanced up with a faint smile. Good morning, Mike, she greeted. How are you today? Better than your grandson, I think, Mike replied, nodding toward Thomas, who had just stepped inside, his frustration still evident. Eleanor sighed, setting her knitting aside. He's been on edge all morning. Can't blame him, I suppose. Mike pulled out a chair, his gaze steady on Thomas. Ethan hasn't called yet. No, Thomas said sharply, grabbing a glass of water from the sink. And I'm not holding my breath. Eleanor gave Mike a knowing look, her voice gentle. Maybe it's just taking him longer than expected. Things like this don't always move quickly. Thomas didn't respond, instead downing the water in one long gulp before setting the glass down with a loud clink. Yeah, well, maybe he's just full of it. Before anyone could reply, the sound of the doorbell echoed through the house. Thomas froze, his eyes narrowing as he glanced toward the front door. Without a word, he walked over and opened it. Ethan stood on the porch, his expression apologetic but determined. He held up his phone, as though it were proof of his efforts. "Sorry I'm late," Ethan said. "The meeting's set for this afternoon. Had to jump through a few hoops to make it happen." Thomas crossed his arms, his skepticism undimmed. "And we're supposed to just take your word for it?" Ethan held his ground, his tone calm but firm. "No, you're supposed to come with me and see for yourself." The tension between them was palpable, but before Thomas could respond, Eleanor's voice cut through the air. "Thomas," she said, her tone both gentle and admonishing, "give the man a chance. If he's made the effort to help, the least we can do is listen." Thomas clenched his jaw, but nodded reluctantly. "Fine. Let's go." The meeting was held at a small office downtown, the kind of unassuming building that housed countless non-profits and community organizations. The woman they met, Ms. Reed, was direct but kind, explaining the emergency housing assistance program in detail. Ethan sat beside Thomas, chiming in occasionally to clarify points or vouch for the Langley family's situation. Mike watched the interaction carefully. Ethan's demeanor was genuine, his commitment clear, but Thomas's tension never fully eased. He answered Ms. Reed's questions with clipped responses, his skepticism barely concealed. When the meeting ended, Ms. Reed handed Thomas a folder of documents to complete. "We'll process this as quickly as we can," she assured him. "If everything checks out, you should hear back within a week." Thomas nodded, his grip on the folder tight. "Thanks." As they left the office, Ethan turned to him, his tone tentative. "See? Not so bad, right?" Thomas stopped, his eyes narrowing. "You think one meeting fixes everything?" Ethan raised his hands, his expression earnest. "No, but it's a step. I'm trying, Thomas. I just want to help." "Yeah, well, maybe you should have tried sooner," Thomas shot back, his frustration boiling over. "You waited 2 years to show up, and now you expect me to trust you." "It doesn't work that way." "Thomas," Mike said quietly, stepping between them. "That's enough." Thomas shook his head, his jaw tight. "I'm going home." He turned and walked away, leaving Mike and Ethan standing in tense silence. Back at the Langley house, the atmosphere was heavy. Thomas disappeared into his room, the sound of his door closing reverberating through the quiet home. Eleanor, sensing the mood, sent Andy and Joey outside to play, then joined Mike in the kitchen. "What happened?" she asked softly. Mike sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Thomas is angry. Ethan's trying, but it's going to take more than a meeting to fix what's broken between them." Eleanor nodded slowly, her gaze thoughtful. "Thomas has always felt the weight of what we've been through. It's hard for him to let go of that. He's been carrying too much for too long," Mike said, "but he's strong. He'll get through this." Eleanor smiled faintly. "Because he has people like you looking out for him." Mike met her gaze, his resolve hardening. "We're not giving up. Not on Thomas, not on any of this." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard, Mike stepped outside to check on the boys. The air was cool, the quiet hum of the neighborhood punctuated by their laughter. It was a small reminder of what they were fighting for: peace, stability, a chance at something better. And for Mike, that was reason enough to keep going. The air inside the Langley home felt charged with tension the next morning, like the moments before a storm breaks. Mike arrived to find Eleanor seated at the kitchen table, her hands folded tightly over the edge of a notebook. Her usual calm demeanor was gone, replaced by a tightness in her expression that set Mike on edge. "Morning," he said gently, setting his coat over the back of a chair. Eleanor glanced up, managing a faint smile. "Morning, Mike." "Thomas is in one of his moods." Mike raised an eyebrow, pulling out a chair. "What happened?" "He's upset about yesterday," she explained, her voice low. "I don't blame him, but the boy has to learn how to handle his anger better." Mike nodded thoughtfully. "Where is he now?" "Out back," Eleanor said, gesturing toward the window. "Said he needed space." Mike stepped outside, finding Thomas leaning against the shed, his arms crossed and his face dark with frustration. He looked up when Mike approached, but didn't say anything. His expression closed off. "You want to talk about it?" Mike asked, leaning against the shed beside him. Thomas scoffed, shaking his head. "What's there to say?" "You tell me," Mike replied evenly. "Something's eating at you." Thomas sighed, raking a hand through his hair. "It's just Ethan. He comes out of nowhere, acts like he's here to save the day, and I'm supposed to be okay with it." Mike gave him a measured look. "You don't have to be okay with it." "But shutting him out doesn't help either." Thomas let out a bitter laugh. "You sound like Grandma." "Smart woman," Mike said with a faint smile. "She's been through enough to know when to let go of a grudge." Thomas's jaw tightened. "It's not a grudge. I don't know what it is. I just can't trust him." Mike placed a hand on his shoulder, his grip firm. "Trust takes time. No one's saying you have to give it to him right now. But give him a chance to prove himself." Thomas didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the patchy grass beneath his feet. Finally, he nodded reluctantly. "I'll try." Later that afternoon, Ethan returned, his demeanor noticeably subdued. He greeted Eleanor warmly, but kept a respectful distance from Thomas, clearly aware of the younger man's lingering unease. Mike observed the interaction carefully, noting the subtle effort Ethan made to avoid pushing boundaries. "I've got some updates," Ethan said as they gathered in the living room. "The charity's moving faster than expected. They've already approved partial coverage for the overdue rent, and they're reviewing the rest of the application now." Eleanor's face lit up with relief. "That's wonderful news, Ethan. Thank you." Thomas, sitting stiffly in a chair near the window, crossed his arms. "What's the catch?" Ethan turned to him, his expression earnest. "There's no catch. They just need a few more documents to finalize everything. Proof of income, utility bills, that sort of thing." Thomas leaned back, his skepticism unrelenting. "Right. More paperwork." Eleanor reached over, placing a hand on his arm. "Thomas, this is good news. Let's focus on that." Thomas sighed but nodded, his resistance softening under her gentle encouragement. "Fine. Let's just get it done." The rest of the day was a blur of activity as they gathered the necessary documents. Lucy stopped by to help, her calm efficiency keeping the process moving smoothly. She worked closely with Eleanor, her reassuring presence helping to ease the older woman's stress. Thomas, however, remained distant, his interactions with Ethan clipped and guarded. Mike stayed close, stepping in when tensions threatened to rise, his presence a stabilizing force. By evening, the documents were ready, neatly organized in a folder that Lucy would deliver to the charity's office the next morning. As they sat around the kitchen table, the air felt lighter, though the underlying tension remained. Eleanor sighed, her hands folded neatly in front of her. "This is progress," she said softly. "I know it doesn't feel like much right now, but it's something." Thomas nodded, though his expression was still guarded. "Yeah. I guess." Ethan leaned forward slightly, his tone tentative. "Thomas, I know I have a lot to make up for, but I meant what I said. I'm here to help." Thomas glanced at him, his jaw tightening. "We'll see." The response was curt but not dismissive, and Ethan seemed to take it as a small victory. He nodded, leaning back with a faint smile. Mike watched the exchange, his chest tightening with a mix of hope and caution. The fractures in their dynamic were still there, but the edges were beginning to soften. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As the evening wound down, Mike found Thomas outside again, leaning against the porch railing. The night air was cool, the faint hum of crickets filling the silence. "You handled yourself well today," Mike said, joining him. Thomas shrugged. "Did what I had to." "That's all anyone can ask," Mike replied. He hesitated, then added, "You know, trust doesn't mean forgetting what happened. It just means giving people a chance to do better." Thomas glanced at him, his expression thoughtful. "You really believe he's trying?" "I do," Mike said simply, "but what matters is what you believe." Thomas nodded slowly, his gaze drifting to the darkened street. "I don't know yet, but I'll give it time." Mike smiled faintly, his voice steady. "That's all you need to do." As they stood in the quiet of the evening, the weight of the day seemed to lift, if only slightly. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, it felt like they were walking it together. And for Mike, that was more than enough to keep moving forward. The next morning brought a biting chill to Riverbend, the kind that crept through even the sturdiest of jackets. Mike arrived at the Langley home to find Thomas pacing the yard, his breath visible in the cold air. He wore a scowl that deepened when he saw Mike approaching. "What's going on?" Mike asked, his tone measured. Thomas gestured toward the house with a sharp motion. "He's back," he muttered. "Ethan said he's got another idea, another favor to call in." Mike frowned, sensing that Thomas's irritation ran deeper than he was letting on. "Did he say what kind of favor?" Thomas shook his head, his hands stuffed into his pockets. "No, but I'm guessing it's something big. Grandma seems all for it, of course." Mike sighed, motioning for Thomas to follow him inside. "Let's hear him out." The tension in the living room was palpable as they entered. Ethan stood by the window, his hands clasped in front of him, while Eleanor sat in her recliner, her expression calm but resolute. She glanced at Thomas as he entered, her eyes softening. "Good morning, Mike," Eleanor said warmly. "We were just discussing something Ethan brought up." Ethan turned, offering a faint smile. "Mike, glad you're here. I was just about to explain." "Let's hear it," Mike said, his tone neutral as he sat down. Ethan took a breath, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. "I've been talking to a friend who works with a housing non-profit. They have a program that could cover the full cost of rent for the next 6 months, but it requires the family to relocate to a different property, something they own, closer to downtown." Thomas's reaction was immediate. "Relocate?" he snapped, his tone sharp. "You want us to leave the only home we have?" "It's not ideal," Ethan admitted, his gaze steady. "But it's a safe place, and it would give you breathing room while you figure out the next steps. No eviction notices, no scrambling to cover bills." Thomas shook his head, his frustration spilling over. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't just a house. It's home. It's the only thing we've got left of Dad." Eleanor sighed, her hands resting lightly on her lap. "Thomas, I understand how you feel, but this might be our best option. We've been fighting to stay here, but maybe it's time to think about what's best for all of us." "What's best?" Thomas repeated, his voice rising. "What's best is not giving up, not letting someone else decide what we're worth." Mike stepped in, his tone firm but calm. Thomas, no one's saying you're giving up. This is about survival, about giving your brothers and your grandmother a stable place to live. Thomas turned to him, his jaw tight. Easy for you to say. You're not the one losing everything. The words stung, but Mike kept his expression steady. I get it, Thomas. I do. But sometimes you have to let go of the fight to save the people you're fighting for. Thomas let out a bitter laugh, pacing the room. I can't believe you're taking his side. Ethan, who had remained silent during the exchange, finally spoke. This isn't about sides, Thomas. It's about giving you all a chance. That's all I'm trying to do. Thomas stopped, his fists clenched at his sides. You think one charity can fix this? That moving us to some random house downtown is going to make everything okay? It's a step, Ethan said quietly. It's not perfect, but it's something. Thomas's gaze flicked to Eleanor, his voice trembling with anger and desperation. And you're okay with this? Eleanor met his gaze, her expression steady but pained. I want what's best for this family, Thomas. If that means starting over, then yes, I'm okay with it. The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over them. Thomas looked away, his shoulders slumping. I can't do this, he muttered, storming out of the house and slamming the door behind him. Mike found Thomas in the backyard, his hands braced against the fence as he stared at the ground. He approached cautiously, his steps deliberate. You want to talk? Mike asked. Thomas shook his head, his voice tight. No. Mike leaned against the fence beside him, giving him space. I know this is hard, Thomas, but you don't have to carry it alone. Thomas let out a shaky breath, his voice barely above a whisper. It's not just the house, Mike. It's everything. Dad, Mom, all the stuff we lost. If we leave, it's like none of it mattered. Mike placed a hand on his shoulder, his grip steady. It mattered, Thomas, and it still does. But your dad wouldn't want you holding on to something that's hurting you more than it's helping. He'd want you to do what's best for your family. Thomas didn't respond, but the tension in his posture eased slightly. They stood in silence for a while, the faint hum of the neighborhood filling the air. Finally, Thomas spoke, his voice quiet but firm. I don't know if I can let go. You don't have to decide right now, Mike said, but when you do, just remember, you're not losing anything. You're building something new. Thomas nodded slowly, his gaze distant. I'll think about it. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Mike felt a flicker of hope. The path forward was still unclear, but the cracks in Thomas's resistance were beginning to show. It wasn't much, but it was a start, and for Mike, that was enough. The morning dawned with a fragile quiet in the Langley household. The tension from the previous day still lingered, heavy and unspoken. Eleanor sat by the window, her knitting abandoned in her lap as she watched the grey clouds roll across the sky. Andy and Joey shuffled quietly between their room and the kitchen, their usual chatter replaced with a subdued energy that reflected the mood of the house. Thomas was nowhere to be seen, and when Mike arrived, Eleanor met him at the door, her expression drawn with worry. He left early, she said softly, stepping aside to let Mike in. Didn't say where he was going. Mike nodded, hanging his coat on the back of a chair. He needs time, he said gently. Yesterday hit him hard. Eleanor sighed, her fingers twisting the hem of her cardigan. I know he's struggling, but I worry about how much he's holding inside. He's always carried more than his share, even when he was little. Mike placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. I'll find him. He'll come around, Eleanor. He just needs to work through it in his own way. Eleanor nodded, though the worry in her eyes didn't fade. Thank you, Mike, for everything. Mike found Thomas at the park, sitting on a weathered bench near the edge of the playground. His head was bowed, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. The wind rustled the bare branches above. the sound a soft counterpoint to the distant laughter of a few children playing on the swings. Mike approached slowly, taking a seat beside him without speaking. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the weight of unspoken words filling the space between them. "I used to come here with Dad," Thomas said finally, his voice low. "We'd play catch over there." He nodded toward a grassy area near the swings. "It feels like a lifetime ago." Mike nodded, giving him the space to continue. Thomas exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "I keep thinking about what he'd say, about leaving the house, about all of this. He worked so hard to keep us there. How can I just let it go?" Mike turned to him, his tone steady but gentle. "Your dad worked hard because he wanted you to have a home. Not just a house, but a place where you felt safe and loved. That doesn't disappear just because the walls change." Thomas shook his head, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "It's not that simple." "No, it's not," Mike agreed, "but holding on to something that's hurting you, that's keeping you stuck. That's not what your dad would want. He'd want you to do what's best for your family." Thomas looked away, his jaw tightening. "It feels like giving up." Mike leaned forward, his hands clasped in front of him. "It's not giving up, Thomas. It's choosing to move forward, and that's one of the hardest choices anyone can make." Thomas didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the ground. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. "I don't know if I can do it." "You can," Mike said firmly, "and you don't have to do it alone." When they returned to the Langley home, the atmosphere had shifted slightly. Andy and Joey ran to greet them, their small hands tugging at Thomas's jacket as they showed him their latest Lego creation. Eleanor watched from her chair, her relief palpable as she saw Thomas's tension begin to ease. Over dinner, the family's laughter returned in small, tentative bursts. Eleanor shared a story from her childhood, her voice soft but animated as Andy and Joey listened with wide-eyed fascination. Even Thomas smiled faintly, though his expression remained thoughtful. After the dishes were cleared, Ethan arrived, his demeanor careful as he stepped inside. He greeted everyone warmly but kept his distance from Thomas, clearly mindful of their strained dynamic. "I wanted to follow up on the housing option," Ethan said, addressing Eleanor and Mike. "They're ready to move forward as soon as you give the green light." Eleanor glanced at Thomas, her gaze steady. "It's not just my decision," she said softly. "This is something we have to decide together." All eyes turned to Thomas, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He looked at Eleanor, then at Ethan, before finally meeting Mike's gaze. "I'm not ready to say yes," Thomas said carefully, "but I'll think about it." Eleanor smiled faintly, her relief evident. "That's all I ask." Ethan nodded, his expression sincere. "Take your time. The offer's not going anywhere." As the evening wore on, the house settled into a rare sense of calm. Andy and Joey fell asleep on the couch, their small frames tangled in a blanket as Eleanor quietly resumed her knitting. Thomas sat at the kitchen table, his hands folded in front of him as he stared at the documents Ethan had left behind. Mike joined him, setting down 2 cups of tea. "Big decision," he said simply. Thomas nodded, his expression distant. "Feels like everything's riding on it." "It's not," Mike said gently. "This is one choice, one step. No matter what you decide, you'll find a way forward. You always do." Thomas looked at him, his expression softening slightly. "Thanks, Mike, for sticking around." Mike smiled, his voice steady. "Always." As the night deepened, Thomas continued to sit at the table, the weight of the decision evident in the set of his shoulders. But for the first time, there was a glimmer of resolve in his eyes, a quiet determination that hinted at the strength he was beginning to rediscover. And for Mike, that was enough. The following morning, The Langley home buzzed with quiet activity. Eleanor stood at the kitchen counter, carefully chopping vegetables for a stew, while Andy and Joey worked on a puzzle spread across the living room floor. The light pouring in through the windows softened the edges of the tension that had settled over the house in recent weeks, though it hadn't disappeared entirely. Thomas sat at the kitchen table, a stack of papers in front of him. His brow furrowed as he stared at the housing agreement Ethan had left behind, his fingers drumming against the edge of the table. When Mike arrived, Thomas barely looked up, his focus locked on the document as though it might reveal something new if he studied it hard enough. "Morning," Mike greeted, hanging his coat on the back of a chair. "You've been at this a while." Thomas nodded, exhaling sharply. "Feels like every word is shouting at me." Mike sat down across from him, his gaze steady. "What's it saying?" "That I'm about to make the biggest mistake of my life," Thomas muttered, his frustration evident. "Or maybe the right choice. I don't even know anymore." Eleanor turned from the counter, her voice gentle but firm. "Thomas, you've always had good instincts. Trust them. They've gotten us this far." Thomas ran a hand through his hair, his expression conflicted. "What if they're wrong this time?" Mike leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Then you adjust. No decision is final, Thomas. What matters is that you're making the best choice with what you know right now." Thomas stared at the paper for another moment before pushing it away, leaning back in his chair. "It's not just about me. This affects everyone." "And everyone trusts you to do what's right," Eleanor said softly. "We always have." Her words hung in the air, their weight settling over the room. Andy and Joey glanced up from their puzzle, sensing the importance of the moment even if they didn't fully understand it. Ethan arrived later that afternoon, his demeanor cautious as he stepped inside. He greeted Eleanor warmly and nodded to Thomas, who acknowledged him with a tight but civil nod. "Any thoughts?" Ethan asked, gesturing toward the housing agreement. Thomas crossed his arms, his jaw tight. "I've been thinking about it all morning." "And?" Ethan prompted. Thomas hesitated, his gaze flicking to Eleanor, then to Mike, before finally landing back on Ethan. "We'll do it," he said quietly. "But on one condition." Ethan nodded, his posture attentive. "Name it." "We do this my way," Thomas said firmly. "No more surprises, no more decisions made without me knowing every detail. If this is supposed to help us, I want to be in control." Ethan smiled faintly, his respect for Thomas evident. "Fair enough. You'll have full transparency, every step of the way," Thomas nodded, his tension easing slightly. "Good." Eleanor reached over, placing a hand on his arm. "You've made the right choice, Thomas. This is a fresh start." Thomas looked at her, his expression softening. "I hope so." The next few hours were spent finalizing the logistics. Ethan explained the timeline, outlining when the move would take place and what support the non-profit would provide. Lucy joined them later in the day, bringing her usual calm efficiency to the process. With her help, they created a plan for packing, scheduling, and ensuring the transition would be as smooth as possible. For the first time in weeks, the atmosphere in the Langley home felt lighter. Andy and Joey buzzed with excitement at the prospect of a new house, asking a flurry of questions about their future rooms and the neighborhood. Even Eleanor seemed more relaxed, her laughter coming more easily as she watched her grandson's enthusiasm. Thomas, however, remained reserved. He worked diligently alongside Lucy and Ethan, but his quiet intensity suggested he was still wrestling with the weight of the decision. Mike stayed close, stepping in when needed, but giving Thomas the space to process in his own way. That evening, after the paperwork was signed and Ethan had left, Mike found Thomas sitting on the porch. The air was crisp and clear, the faint scent of wood smoke drifting from a nearby chimney. The street was quiet, the houses bathed in the soft glow of porch lights. Long day, Mike said, sitting beside him. Thomas nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Feels like the longest one yet. Mike leaned back, his hands resting on his knees. How are you feeling about everything? Thomas hesitated, then shrugged. I don't know, relieved, I guess, but scared too. Like I'm giving up something I can't get back. You're not giving up, Mike said gently. You're making room for something new, something better. Thomas looked at him, his expression conflicted. I want to believe that. I'm not there yet. Mike placed a hand on his shoulder, his grip firm but reassuring. You'll get there. You've done the hard part, choosing to move forward. The rest will come. Thomas nodded slowly, his shoulders relaxing slightly. Thanks, Mike, for everything. Always, Mike said, his voice steady. As they sat together in the quiet of the evening, the weight of the decision seemed to ease, if only slightly. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, it felt like the Langley family was stepping onto solid ground. And for Mike, that was enough to keep going. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.